Chernobyl Meltdown. There is a city in northern Ukraine where the Ferris wheel never gave a single ride. Pripyat was built to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and on April 27, 1986, every one of its 49,000 residents was loaded onto buses and told they would be back in 3 days. Nobody ever came back. The night before, a crew of engineers ran a safety test on reactor number 4. They wanted to know if the turbines could generate enough power to keep coolant pumps running during a blackout. To make the test work, they disabled the automatic shutdown system, pulled out nearly all the control rods, and pushed the reactor into a condition so unstable that even the operators knew something felt wrong. At 1:23 in the morning, power spiked to roughly 100 times the reactor's intended maximum in less than a second. A steam explosion launched the 1,000-ton reactor lid into the air like a coin. A second blast followed, ripping the building open and hurling chunks of radioactive graphite across the compound. Firefighters arrived within minutes. Nobody told them the debris glowing on the ground was reactor core. They picked it up with their hands. Several were dead within weeks, their bodies breaking down at the cellular level from radiation doses that measured in the thousands of Roentgens. Meanwhile, the Soviet government said nothing. 36 hours passed before Pripyat was evacuated. The outside world only learned something had happened when Swedish scientists detected abnormal radiation levels drifting across Scandinavia over 1,000 kilometers away. 350,000 people were eventually displaced. The exclusion zone still stretches across 2,600 square kilometers of forest and abandoned villages. Wild animals roam through empty apartment blocks. Cleanup has cost over $235 billion across 4 decades and is nowhere near finished. The men who ran that test were not incompetent. They were operating inside a system where questioning orders was more dangerous than a nuclear meltdown. Every safety override that night was approved by someone afraid of the person above them. Challenger explosion. The night before launch, an engineer named Roger Boisjoli sat at a conference table and begged his managers not to let the shuttle fly. He had the data. He had the photographs. He had years of documentation showing that the rubber O-ring sealing the rocket boosters grew stiff and unreliable in cold weather. The forecast for Cape Canaveral the next morning was 36 degrees Fahrenheit. His managers overruled him. 73 seconds after liftoff, 7 people were dead. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart over the Atlantic Ocean. Among the crew was Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, selected from over 11,000 applicants to become the first private citizen in space. Millions of schoolchildren watched the launch live on classroom televisions. When the vehicle disintegrated, it did not explode in the traditional sense. The external fuel tank ruptured and aerodynamic forces tore the orbiter apart at twice the speed of sound. The crew cabin, largely intact, fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds before slamming into the ocean at over 200 miles per hour. 3 emergency oxygen packs had been manually activated, which means at least some crew members were conscious during the fall. The O-ring that failed was about as thick as a pencil. It sat in a joint on the right solid rocket booster, and its job was to contain 3,000-degree combustion gases. Morton Thiokol, the company that made the boosters, had documented O-ring erosion on previous flights. Each time it happened without catastrophe, NASA absorbed the anomaly as normal. Engineers even had a term for this process. They called it normalization of deviance. A known defect gets reclassified as an acceptable risk because nothing bad has happened yet. Boisjoli never recovered. He left the aerospace industry and spent the rest of his life speaking at engineering schools, telling students that their technical conclusions mean nothing if they cannot force the people making decisions to actually listen. NASA fixed the O-ring joint after Challenger, but the deeper problem, a culture that treated dissent as inconvenience, killed 7 more people 17 years later on Columbia. Titanic's iceberg. Frederick Fleet was squinting into total darkness from the crow's nest of the RMS Titanic on the night of April 14, 1912. No moon, no wind. The Atlantic was so still it looked like black glass, which was actually terrible for spotting icebergs because there were no waves breaking white against them. Fleet had no binoculars. The locker that held them was locked, and the key was in the pocket of an officer who had been reassigned before departure. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet saw a dark shape dead ahead. He rang the bell 3 times and called the bridge. The iceberg was about 500 meters away. At the speed the ship was moving, the crew had less than 40 seconds. The Titanic had received at least 6 ice warnings by radio that day. Captain Edward Smith acknowledged some and did not slow down. The ship was running at 22 knots through a known ice field because arriving on schedule mattered more than caution. First Officer Murdoch ordered a hard turn to port. The ship responded too slowly. The iceberg did not smash into the bow like in the movies. It scraped along the starboard side below the waterline, buckling hull plates and popping rivets across a stretch of roughly 90 meters. Water poured into 6 of 16 watertight compartments. The ship could float with 4 flooded, not 6. What followed was a masterclass in compounding failures. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, enough for about half the people on board. The British Board of Trade had last updated lifeboat regulations in 1894, when the biggest ships were a fraction of the Titanic's tonnage. Officers launched boats partially empty because they feared the davits would snap under full weight. Lifeboat number 1 left with 12 people in a vessel built for 40. Third-class passengers were held below decks by locked gates, while first-class passengers were escorted topside. Over 1,500 people went into water that was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia kills in about 15 minutes at that temperature. The builders at Harland and Wolff had marketed the Titanic as practically unsinkable, and the White Star Line leaned into that language so aggressively that it became received fact. The result was a ship designed with supreme confidence and operated with supreme carelessness. Speed was not reduced, warnings were not heeded, lifeboats were not filled. The Titanic did not sink because of an iceberg. It sank because every person in a position of authority treated a marketing slogan as an engineering specification. Hindenburg Disaster. For exactly 34 seconds, the most majestic aircraft ever constructed transformed into 800 feet of falling fire, while a radio reporter screamed into his microphone and a newsreel camera captured every frame. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg did not just crash at Lakehurst, New Jersey. It killed an entire category of transportation in front of a live audience. The LZ-129 Hindenburg was 245 meters long, bigger than 3 Boeing 747s lined up nose to tail. It had dining rooms, a lounge with a grand piano, and promenade decks with angled windows so passengers could watch the Atlantic pass beneath them. Tickets cost the equivalent of roughly $9,000 today, and the ship had already made 17 successful transatlantic crossings. On this flight from Frankfurt, it carried 36 passengers and 61 crew. Thunderstorms delayed the landing by hours. At 7:25 p.m., as ground crews grabbed the mooring lines, witnesses saw a small flicker of light near the upper tail fin. The hydrogen ignited. 7 million cubic feet of gas went up in a cascading wall of flame that consumed the entire airship before it hit the ground. 62 of the 97 people aboard survived, mostly by jumping from the gondola windows. The dead included 13 passengers and 22 crew members, along with one ground worker. What made the Hindenburg unique among disasters was not the body count, which was relatively small, but the media footprint. Herbert Morrison's radio recording, with his voice breaking mid-sentence, played in homes across America. Newsreel footage ran in cinemas worldwide within days. The Hindenburg became the first catastrophe experienced by a mass audience in something close to real time. Germany knew hydrogen was dangerous. They had wanted to use helium, which is inert and cannot burn. But the United States held a near monopoly on the global helium supply and had passed the Helium Control Act specifically to restrict exports. Washington did not trust the Nazi government, and with good reason. So the Zeppelin company chose to fly with hydrogen because the alternative was grounding the fleet entirely. A single American export policy, born from justified political distrust, forced a flammable gas into 7 million cubic feet of aircraft and turned one bad landing into the extinction of commercial airship travel worldwide. Bhopal Gas Leak. At roughly midnight on December 3, 1984, a pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide released a cloud of methyl isocyanate gas over the sleeping city of Bhopal, India. People woke up choking, blind, unable to understand why their lungs were on fire. Parents grabbed children and ran into streets already filled with white fog. Many ran toward the plant because they did not know the gas was coming from that direction. Within hours, thousands were dead. The final toll, accumulated over years of slow poisoning, is somewhere between 16 and 25,000 people. It remains the deadliest industrial disaster in human history, and the man responsible died in his Connecticut home without ever facing trial. The plant stored methyl isocyanate in large underground tanks. That night, water entered tank 610, triggering a violent exothermic reaction. Pressure built. The gas had to go somewhere. In a properly functioning facility, 3 separate safety systems would have intervened. The refrigeration unit that kept the chemical cool had been shut off 5 months earlier because managers decided the electricity cost was not justified. The gas scrubber, designed to neutralize any leaked chemical before it reached the atmosphere, was undersized for the tank capacity and was not operational. The flare tower, the final failsafe meant to burn off escaping gas at high altitude, was disconnected for maintenance. 3 layers of protection, 3 independent decisions to save money, 3 zeros where there should have been safeguards. The gas is heavier than air. It rolled along the ground through Bhopal's densely packed neighborhoods, settling into low-lying areas where the poorest communities lived. People who lay down to rest or who fell while running inhaled the highest concentrations. Over 500,000 people were exposed. Survivors developed chronic lung disease, blindness, neurological damage, and immune disorders that persisted for decades. Children born to exposed mothers showed elevated rates of birth defects. The factory grounds were never fully decontaminated. Soil and groundwater testing conducted 40 years after the disaster still shows toxic contamination. Union Carbide Chief Executive Officer Warren Anderson flew to Bhopal and was arrested on arrival, then released on bail within hours and allowed to leave the country. He never returned to India. In 1989, Union Carbide settled with the Indian government for $470 million. Divided across the estimated victims, that works out to roughly $500 per person poisoned. Anderson was declared a fugitive by Indian courts in 2009. He died at home in Vero Beach, Florida in 2014 at the age of 92. Dow Chemical, which later acquired Union Carbide, has consistently refused to accept liability for the ongoing contamination. Bhopal is not a story about an industrial accident. It is a story about what happens when poisoning poor people in a developing country costs less than installing safety equipment. Deepwater Horizon spill. The blowout preventer was the last line of defense, an 18,000-pound hydraulic device bolted to the ocean floor, designed to slam shut and seal a well if everything else fails. On April 20, 2010, everything else failed on the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, 41 miles off the Louisiana coast. The blowout preventer did not activate. 11 men died in the initial explosion, and for the next 87 days, oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico, while the most technologically advanced energy company on Earth tried and failed, publicly and repeatedly, to plug a hole in the seabed a mile underwater. The rig had been drilling an exploratory well called Macondo. The operation was 43 days behind schedule, costing BP roughly $1 million per day in leasing fees. On the afternoon of the blowout, a pressure test on the well showed abnormal readings. Multiple interpretations were possible. The crew chose the one that let them keep working. At 9:45 p.m., a column of methane gas erupted up the drill pipe, expanded explosively as it hit surface pressure, and ignited. The rig burned for 36 hours before sinking, dragging the riser pipe down and leaving the broken wellhead gushing crude directly into the sea from 5,000 feet below the surface. 4.9 million barrels of oil escaped before the well was finally capped in mid-July. That is roughly 210 million gallons, enough to fill over 300 Olympic swimming pools every day for 3 months. The slick spread across 57,000 square miles. Over 1,300 miles of coastline from Texas to Florida were contaminated. Scientists documented the deaths of over 8,000 birds, nearly 2,000 sea turtles, and uncounted fish and marine invertebrates, though these were only the carcasses recovered. The actual mortality was orders of magnitude higher. The Gulf's herring population collapsed. Shrimpers and oystermen lost entire seasons. Tourism revenue across 5 states cratered. BP's final bill exceeded $65 billion in fines, cleanup, and settlements, making Deepwater Horizon the most expensive corporate disaster in history. But the audit trail tells the uglier story. The blowout preventer had a known defect in its hydraulic system. Workers had flagged it weeks before. The rubber seal inside the device, called an annular element, was damaged and leaking. BP's own risk analyses had identified the Macondo well as high risk. None of this changed the schedule. The rig was behind, and every day of delay cost money that someone had to justify to someone above them. The entire catastrophe can be traced to a series of small, individually rational cost-benefit decisions that collectively amounted to gambling with the Gulf of Mexico. The earthquake did not break the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. A magnitude 9.0 quake, the 5th most powerful ever recorded by instruments, hit off the northeast coast of Japan on March 11, 2011. The 3 operating reactors detected the seismic activity and shut down automatically, exactly as designed. The control rods slammed into position. The chain reaction stopped. For roughly 41 minutes, everything worked perfectly. Then a 46-foot wall of seawater arrived and the entire plan fell apart. Nuclear fuel does not stop generating heat when you shut down a reactor. Fission products continue decaying, and without active cooling, temperatures climbed toward meltdown within hours. The cooling pumps at Fukushima ran on electricity. The earthquake severed the external power grid. Backup diesel generators kicked on immediately. Then the tsunami overtopped the seawall, which had been built to withstand a wave roughly half the height of the one that arrived. The generators were installed in the basements of the turbine buildings. They flooded. Within minutes, 3 reactors had no cooling and no way to restore it. Over the following 3 days, the fuel in all 3 cores melted through the reactor vessels and pooled at the bottom of the containment structures. Hydrogen gas, generated by the superheated fuel reacting with water, accumulated in the reactor buildings and detonated in a series of explosions that cracked containment and sent radioactive cesium and iodine drifting across the Fukushima prefecture. 154,000 people were evacuated. Tens of thousands remained displaced a decade and a half later. Over 1,000 steel tanks now hold contaminated water at the plant site, a logistics problem that will persist for generations. The cleanup timeline is 30 to 40 years. Cost estimates exceed $200 billion. The surrounding exclusion zone spans 20 kilometers in every direction, and within it, nature is reclaiming the towns, schools, and train stations that humans abandoned overnight. TEPCO, the plant operator, had a 2008 internal study estimating that a tsunami as high as 10.2 meters could hit the facility. The seawall was built for 5.7 meters. Management shelved the study. Upgrading the wall would have been expensive and politically uncomfortable, requiring an implicit admission that the existing design was inadequate. A separate government panel had also warned that the Fukushima coast was historically prone to massive tsunamis. None of these findings translated into action. The generators stayed in the basements. The seawall stayed the same height. And on a Friday afternoon in March, the Pacific Ocean delivered the scenario that everyone knew was possible and nobody wanted to pay to prevent. Mars Climate Orbiter, $327.6 million worth of spacecraft, burned up in the Martian atmosphere because one engineering team used metric units and another used imperial, and nobody checked. It is the most expensive unit conversion error in history. The Mars Climate Orbiter launched on December 11, 1998, designed to study the Martian atmosphere and serve as a communication relay. Lockheed Martin, the spacecraft manufacturer, wrote its thruster software to output force values in pound-seconds, an imperial unit. NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which operated the mission, expected those values in Newton-seconds, a metric unit. 1 pound of force equals roughly 4.45 newtons. Every course correction over the 9-month journey was off by that factor. The error accumulated silently. On September 23, 1999, the orbiter arrived at Mars and began its insertion maneuver, dipping into the upper atmosphere to slow down. But instead of passing over the surface at an altitude of 150 kilometers as planned, the spacecraft descended to just 57 kilometers, well within the zone where atmospheric friction would tear it apart. Contact was lost. The orbiter either burned up or skipped off the atmosphere into a useless orbit around the Sun. 2 teams of brilliant engineers worked on the same spacecraft for years and never once confirmed they were speaking the same mathematical language. Navigation data reviews during the flight had flagged anomalies, but they were attributed to other causes. A report after the loss found that there was no formal process requiring verification of unit consistency between contractor software and NASA systems. The spacecraft was not killed by bad math. Everyone did their math perfectly. They just did it in two different measurement systems and assumed alignment that never existed. NASA's Hubble Mirror Flaw. After 15 years of development, $1.5 billion in spending, and the combined efforts of thousands of scientists and engineers across NASA and its contractors, the Hubble Space Telescope was deployed into orbit on April 25, 1990. Scientists trained the instruments on a star cluster and waited for the sharpest images ever taken from space. What came back was blurry, not subtly soft, visibly, obviously, unmistakably out of focus. The most important optical instrument in the history of astronomy had a defective mirror. The primary mirror measured 2.4 meters across and had been polished by the contractor Perkin-Elmer to extraordinary precision, except at the very outer edge, where the curvature was too flat by 2.2 micrometers. That is about 1/50th the width of a human hair. It is also roughly the distance between a telescope that works and a telescope that cannot focus light into a clean point. The condition is called spherical aberration, and it meant that Hubble could not produce the diffraction-limited images it had been built to deliver. For a project that had been sold to Congress and the public as the future of space science, the flaw was catastrophic. The root cause was a testing device called a null corrector, a precision optical instrument used during manufacturing to verify the mirror's shape. A tiny spacer inside the null corrector was off by 1.3 millimeters. This error caused the device to certify the mirror as perfect when it was not. Other quality control tests performed during production had actually detected the aberration, but Perkin-Elmer's engineers trusted the null corrector above all else. When their primary tool contradicted independent measurements, they discarded the independent measurements, confirmation bias, applied at the nanometer scale. In December 1993, astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour installed CoStar, a set of corrective optics that functioned like a pair of contact lenses for the telescope. The fix worked. Hubble went on to transform astrophysics, measuring the expansion rate of the universe, detecting supermassive black holes, imaging deep fields containing galaxies billions of light-years away. It became arguably the most productive scientific instrument ever built. But for 3 years, the most advanced eye humanity had ever aimed at the cosmos wore the wrong prescription because one team trusted their instrument more than reality. Y2K Panic. On January 1st, 2000, the world woke up and nothing exploded. Planes did not fall from the sky. Banks did not erase their records. Power grids held. Traffic lights worked. Within weeks, Y2K became a punchline, the dumbest overreaction in modern memory, a $300 billion global freakout over a computer bug that turned out to be nothing. Except, it was not nothing. It was one of the largest and most successful emergency engineering efforts in history, and the reward for pulling it off was being ridiculed for having bothered. The bug was not a myth. In the 1960s and 70s, computer memory was prohibitively expensive. Programmers saved bytes wherever they could, and one of the most common shortcuts was representing years with 2 digits instead of 4. 99 instead of 1999. It worked fine for decades, until the calendar was about to roll over to a year that those 2-digit systems would interpret as 1900. Banking software, power grid controllers, air traffic management systems, military command networks, hospital monitoring equipment, and government databases across the world ran on legacy code built with this shortcut. The systems were not obscure. They were the backbone of modern civilization, and they were scheduled to misread the dates simultaneously. Starting in the mid-90s, governments and corporations launched a remediation effort of staggering scope. The United States alone spent over $100 billion. Banks audited billions of lines of COBOL, many written by programmers who had since retired or died. Utility companies tested every embedded system in every substation. Airlines recertified avionics software. Military planners gamed out scenarios where weapons systems misinterpreted the date. Entire teams of COBOL programmers were pulled out of retirement because younger developers had never touched the language. Countries that invested heavily, the US, UK, Australia, and much of Western Europe, experienced virtually no failures. Countries that invested less saw scattered breakdowns in smaller systems. Y2K worked. The fix was deployed globally, on schedule, across millions of systems, in a coordinated effort that had no historical precedent. And because it worked, because the catastrophe was averted rather than survived, the public concluded the threat had been fake. Prevention is invisible. When the bridge does not collapse, nobody thanks the engineer who inspected it. When the pandemic does not spread, nobody credits the quarantine. Y2K cost the global economy over $600 billion in direct remediation spending, and the result was so seamlessly successful that the effort was rebranded as hysteria by the people it protected. Lehman Brothers collapse. Dick Fould had a nickname on Wall Street. They called him the Gorilla, partly for his aggressive deal-making and partly for the way he stared down anyone who questioned him. In the summer of 2008, analysts, journalists, and even his own executives tried to warn him that Lehman Brothers was sitting on a mountain of assets that were rapidly becoming worthless. Fould told them the firm was fine. On September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed the largest bankruptcy in American history, and within weeks, the entire global financial system was in free fall. Lehman had gorged itself on subprime mortgages throughout the mid-2000s. The strategy was simple and spectacularly reckless. Buy enormous volumes of risky home loans, bundle them into mortgage-backed securities, assign them misleading credit ratings, and sell them to investors worldwide. At its peak, the firm held over $600 billion in assets, a huge portion tied directly to the American housing market. When home prices started falling in 2007, the value of those holdings cratered. Lehman reported quarterly losses that grew each period. Fould publicly insisted the firm was adequately capitalized while privately begging Bank of America and the Korean Development Bank for a buyout. Both walked away. The bankruptcy filing hit the financial system like a cardiac arrest. Credit markets froze overnight. Banks that had lent to Lehman or held Lehman-linked derivatives suddenly did not know if they would be paid back. They stopped lending to each other. The commercial paper market, which corporations rely on to meet payroll and fund daily operations, seized up. Money market funds that held Lehman debt broke the buck, meaning investors lost principal in a vehicle marketed as virtually risk-free. The Dow Jones fell 500 points the day Lehman filed and kept falling for months. Global stock markets lost over $10 trillion in value. The aftermath stretched across years and continents. In the United States, unemployment reached 10%. Roughly 10 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. Iceland's banking system collapsed entirely. Greece spiraled into a sovereign debt crisis that lasted a decade. Governments worldwide spent trillions in bailouts and stimulus. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates to essentially zero and held them there for 7 years. And Dick Fould, the man who insisted everything was fine while his firm loaded up on toxic assets, walked away with an estimated $500 million in pre-crash compensation. He never faced criminal charges. Not one senior Lehman executive did. Enron Fraud. For 6 straight years, Fortune magazine named Enron the most innovative company in America. Wall Street analysts competed to assign the highest price targets. Business school professors taught Enron's model as the future of the energy industry. At its peak, the company was valued at over $70 billion. Then, in the autumn of 2001, the whole thing disintegrated in a matter of weeks. And it turned out that the most innovative thing about Enron was how creatively it had been lying. The architecture of the fraud was almost admirable in its complexity. Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow constructed a web of over 3,000 special-purpose entities, shell companies with names like LJM and Chuco that existed for one purpose. They absorbed Enron's debt and manufactured the appearance of revenue. Fastow personally controlled several of these entities and used them to funnel tens of millions of dollars to himself, a detail his bosses either did not know about or chose not to investigate. Arthur Andersen, one of the 5 largest accounting firms on Earth, signed off on these arrangements for years, earning roughly $1 million per week in combined audit and consulting fees from Enron. When the house of cards started wobbling, Andersen employees shredded documents by the truckload. In October 2001, Enron disclosed a $618 million quarterly loss and quietly revealed it had overstated earnings by nearly $600 million over the previous 4 years. The stock, which had traded above $90, was below $1 within weeks. On December 2nd, the company filed for bankruptcy. 20,000 people lost their jobs. Thousands of employees who had been encouraged to hold Enron stock in their retirement accounts watched their life savings vanish. The pension fund, heavily weighted toward company shares, became worthless overnight. Chief Executive Officer Jeffrey Skilling got 24 years, later reduced to 14. Fastow served 6. Chairman Ken Lay was convicted on multiple counts, but died of a heart attack before sentencing, which legally vacated his conviction. Arthur Andersen, 85,000 employees strong, was found guilty of obstruction of justice and effectively ceased to exist, though the Supreme Court later overturned the conviction on narrow grounds. The conviction did not matter by then. The firm was already dead. What Enron exposed was not just one rotten company. It was the failure of every institution that was supposed to catch the rot. Auditors audited nothing. Analysts analyzed nothing. Regulators regulated nothing. The entire system of corporate oversight was a performance, and Enron was the company that proved it. Theranos Scam. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19, founded a blood testing company, and within a decade had convinced Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, 2 former Secretaries of State, Rupert Murdoch, and the Walgreens pharmacy chain, that she could run hundreds of diagnostic tests from a single drop of blood. Her company reached a valuation of $9 billion. The technology never worked. Not once. Not even close. The device was called the Edison. It was supposed to analyze a tiny fingerprick blood sample and deliver results for a comprehensive panel of tests within minutes, all in a compact box that could sit in a pharmacy or a doctor's office. Holmes modeled herself explicitly on Steve Jobs, wearing the same black turtleneck, speaking in a manufactured baritone that multiple former colleagues described as fake, and cultivating an aura of visionary secrecy around her product. The board she assembled was stacked with political and military heavyweights who knew nothing about medical diagnostics, but whose names lent enormous credibility to fundraising pitches. Inside the lab, the reality was grim. The Edison produced wildly inaccurate results. When Theranos could not get its own device to work, it quietly ran most patient samples on standard commercial analyzers made by Siemens, often diluting the tiny fingerprick volumes to create enough liquid for the machines. patients received test results that were wrong. Some got false positives for serious conditions and underwent unnecessary medical procedures. Others got false negatives and missed real diseases. Employees who raised concerns were met with threats, surveillance, and legal intimidation. Holmes hired David Boies, one of the most powerful attorneys in the country, to enforce non-disclosure agreements and silence whistleblowers. In 2015, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou published an investigation that cracked the facade open. Holmes was indicted on 11 counts of wire fraud in 2018. Her trial became a national spectacle, partly because the defense tried to blame her former boyfriend and business partner, Sunny Balwani, for the deception. In January 2022, a jury convicted her on 4 counts. She was sentenced to over 11 years in prison. But Theranos is not really the story of one fraudster. It is the story of an ecosystem, investors, board members, journalists, pharmacy executives, that handed over hundreds of millions of dollars because the founder sounded confident and the vision was exciting and absolutely nobody demanded to see the actual data. Kodak ignoring digital. In 1975, a 24-year-old Kodak engineer named Stephen Sasson soldered together a prototype that would eventually destroy his employer. It was the size of a toaster. It weighed 8 pounds. It captured a black and white image of 100 by 100 pixels and took 23 seconds to write it to a cassette tape. It was the world's first digital camera. Sasson showed it to his bosses. They told him it was cute, and then they told him to keep quiet about it. Kodak did not miss the digital revolution by accident. They saw it coming with perfect clarity because they built it. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Kodak's own research labs continued advancing digital imaging. The company held over 1,000 patents in the field. They built some of the first consumer digital cameras in the mid-90s. Kodak engineers knew where photography was headed because they were inventing the tools that would take it there. But Kodak's leadership looked at digital and saw one thing clearly. Every digital photograph taken was a roll of film not purchased, a set of prints not ordered, a bottle of developing chemicals not sold. Film and its surrounding consumables generated massive margins. Digital eliminated the consumable entirely. So Kodak throttled its own digital efforts for over 2 decades. When leadership did invest in digital products, the efforts were half-hearted, underfunded, and strategically orphaned within the company. Meanwhile, Sony, Canon, and Fujifilm committed aggressively. Fujifilm is the most telling comparison. It faced the exact same threat as Kodak, a core film business being eaten by digital, and responded by diversifying into medical imaging, cosmetics, and materials science, while simultaneously building a serious digital camera division. Kodak, paralyzed by the profitability of its existing model, refused to cannibalize itself. The market did it for them. In January 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At its peak in 1996, the company had been worth over $31 billion and employed over 140,000 people worldwide. The camera that killed them was a descendant of the device their own engineer built in a lab in Rochester, New York in 1975. Kodak is not a story about a company that failed to innovate. It is a story about a company that innovated first, understood exactly what their innovation meant for their business, and decided that the present was too comfortable to sacrifice for the future. The future came anyway. Blockbuster rejecting Netflix. In the year 2000, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph flew to Dallas, walked into Blockbuster's corporate headquarters, and offered to sell their struggling DVD by mail startup for $50 million. They proposed a partnership where Netflix would run Blockbuster's online brand, and Blockbuster would promote Netflix in its 9,000 stores. Blockbuster Chief Executive Officer John Antioco and his team reportedly found it difficult not to laugh. Netflix at the time had about 300,000 subscribers and was hemorrhaging cash. Blockbuster had 65 million registered customers and $6 billion in annual revenue. The meeting lasted about an hour. Hastings and Randolph flew home with nothing. The thing Blockbuster could not see past was late fees. The company charged customers penalties for returning movies after their due date, and this single revenue line generated roughly $800 million a year, about 16% of total revenue. The late fee was both Blockbuster's greatest financial asset and its greatest strategic weakness, because it was the exact customer pain point that Netflix and later Redbox were designed to eliminate. Blockbuster's entire business model required customers to make trips to physical stores, pick titles from available inventory, and return them on time or pay extra. Netflix required none of this. To their credit, Blockbuster was not completely asleep. Under Antioco, the company launched Blockbuster Online in the mid-2000s, a DVD by mail service that actually gained traction, pulling in over 2 million subscribers by 2006. But when activist investor Carl Icahn forced a boardroom shakeup and installed new Chief Executive Officer Jim Keyes in 2007, the online division's funding was slashed. Keyes publicly declared that Blockbuster's core business was physical retail, that neither Netflix nor Redbox posed a serious threat, and that the company's future was in its stores. He said this in 2008, the same year Netflix launched its streaming service. Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy in September 2010. Netflix passed $100 billion in market capitalization. A single franchise location in Bend, Oregon, survives as a tourist attraction and cultural relic. The $50th million offer that Antioco laughed off now looks like the greatest bargain in business history. But the deeper failure was not the rejected deal. It was the conviction, shared across Blockbuster's leadership, that their business model was durable simply because it was currently profitable. Revenue became a narcotic that numbed them to the structural obsolescence building underneath. Nokia ignoring smartphones. In 2007, Nokia sold more mobile phones than any company on the planet, 40% of the global market, over 400 million handsets a year. They had research labs, manufacturing at scale, brand recognition on every continent, and a decade of dominance in an industry they had helped create. 5 years later, their handset division was being sold to Microsoft for pennies on the peak dollar. Nokia did not get out-competed. They got outrun by a future they saw coming and refused to chase. Nokia engineers built touchscreen prototypes and internet-connected tablet concepts as early as 2004, years before Apple shipped anything comparable. The company had the technical talent. What it lacked was the institutional willingness to act on what that talent was showing them. Nokia's corporate culture rewarded operational efficiency, unit volume, and incremental hardware improvement. Software was an afterthought. Middle management was terrified of delivering bad news upward, so senior leadership received a steady diet of filtered optimism while the ground shifted beneath them. Internal memos from the period read like dispatches from a company sleepwalking toward a cliff. When Apple unveiled the iPhone in June 2007, Nokia's public response was dismissal. Senior executives pointed out that the device lacked a physical keyboard, was tethered to a single carrier, and cost $500 without a subsidy. All valid criticisms of the iPhone as it existed on day one. All completely irrelevant to where the market was going. Google launched Android the following year. offering a free operating system to any manufacturer willing to adopt it. Samsung, HTC, and LG jumped in. Nokia clung to Symbian, an operating system that worked well for feature phones, but was architecturally incapable of competing in the app ecosystem era. By 2011, incoming Chief Executive Officer Stephen Elop circulated a memo comparing Nokia to a man standing on a burning oil platform, deciding whether to jump into freezing water. He jumped toward Microsoft, betting the company on Windows Phone. The platform never gained meaningful market share. Microsoft bought Nokia's Devices and Services division in 2014 for $7.2 billion, wrote off most of the investment within a year, and laid off over 25,000 employees, most of them former Nokia staff. The company that once put a phone in nearly half the world's pockets was dismantled, not by a superior competitor, but by its own inability to let go of the thing that had made it successful. Yahoo rejecting Google. Here is a number that should make you physically uncomfortable. In 2002, Yahoo could have purchased Google for $5 billion. The board discussed it. Chief Executive Officer Terry Semel entered negotiations. Google's founders were willing to deal. Yahoo's board decided $5 billion was too much money for a company whose only product was a search box. Google is now valued at over $1.7 trillion. In the late 90s, Yahoo was the king of the internet. It was the default homepage for millions of users, a web portal offering email, news, weather, sports scores, stock quotes, and search. But Yahoo never treated search as the core product. It was one feature among many, a utility that existed to keep people inside the Yahoo ecosystem. When two Stanford PhD students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin built a search engine with a radically superior algorithm called PageRank, Yahoo actually partnered with them. For 2 years, every search performed on Yahoo was secretly powered by Google. Every query taught Google more about user intent. Yahoo was feeding its future executioner and paying for the privilege. Semel eventually recognized the danger and opened acquisition talks with Page and Brin. Google was initially willing to sell for $3 billion. Yahoo offered $2 billion. Google countered at $5 billion. Semel's board could not justify the premium. They believed, reasonably by the standards of 2002, that search was a commodity and that Yahoo could build or buy equivalent technology for less. They acquired the search companies Inktomi and Overture for a combined $1.7 billion. Neither came close to matching Google's capabilities. Google went public in 2004 at a valuation of $23 billion and never looked back. Yahoo spent the next 15 years cycling through 6 CEOs, selling off divisions, and missing every major shift from social to mobile to cloud. In 2017, Verizon acquired Yahoo's core internet business for $4.5 billion, less than the $5 billion Google had asked for 15 years earlier. Semel's board made a defensible decision based on the information available in 2002. But defensible decisions can still be catastrophic. The cost of being wrong about Google was not $5 billion. It was the entire future of the company. Excite rejecting Google. Before Yahoo said no, there was an even earlier rejection, and this one is almost too painful to believe. In 1999, Larry Page walked into the offices of Excite, at the time one of the top search engines on the internet, and offered to sell Google's search technology for $1 million. Excite haggled it down to $750,000. Then they said no. They said no to a technology now worth north of $1 trillion for less than the price of a San Francisco apartment. Excite was a web portal competing with Yahoo, Lycos, and Alta Vista. Its strategy was built around being a sticky destination site, a place where users would spend time reading content, clicking links, and viewing advertisements. Search was a means to an end. Get them to the site, show them ads, keep them browsing. When Page demonstrated Google's search algorithm, which returned dramatically better and more relevant results. Excite Chief Executive Officer George Bell reportedly identified the core problem immediately, but drew exactly the wrong conclusion. Better search results meant users found what they wanted faster. Finding things faster meant they left Excite sooner. Leaving sooner meant fewer page views and fewer ad impressions. Bell rejected Google specifically because the technology was too effective. Venture capitalist Vinod Khosla, who had connections to both Page and Bell, brokered the negotiations and personally pushed Bell to take the deal. According to Khosla's later accounts, the final price had been walked down from $1 million to $750,000 to make it irresistible. Bell still refused. His business model measured success in time on site, and a search engine that actually solved the user's problem was a threat to that metric. Excite merged with broadband provider At Home in a deal valued at billions, rebranded as Excite at Home, and filed for bankruptcy in 2001. The combined entity's remains were sold off for almost nothing. Google went on to become the single most dominant gateway to the internet, processing over 8.5 billion searches per day. Bell's logic was internally consistent. Better search did reduce time on site. What he failed to understand was that users do not owe you their time, and that a business model built on making people's experience worse was already dying. He just could not see it because the revenue was still coming in. Decca rejecting the Beatles. On New Year's Day, 1962, 4 young men from Liverpool loaded their equipment into a van and drove 200 miles through snow to Decca Record Studios in London. They were nervous, playing in an unfamiliar room on unfamiliar equipment, and the 15-song audition tape they recorded that morning was far from their best work. A Decca executive named Dick Rowe listened to the recordings, weighed them against another act he was considering, and passed. He reportedly told the band's manager, Brian Epstein, that guitar groups were on the way out. The 4 musicians were John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Pete Best. They were the Beatles. Rowe was choosing between the Beatles and Brian Poole and the Tremolos, a group from Dagenham, much closer to London. The Tremolos were cheaper to work with, easier to get into the studio, and played a style that fit comfortably within the current pop landscape. The Beatles were an unknown quantity from a city that the London music establishment did not take seriously. Their sound was raw. Their stage presence was unpolished compared to their later work, and the audition tape, by the band's own admission, did not capture what made them special in a live setting. On its face, the decision was not insane. Rowe picked the safer bet. Epstein spent the next months getting rejected by Pi Records, Philips, Columbia, and HMV. He was running out of labels. Finally, George Martin at Parlophone, a small EMI subsidiary that mostly released comedy records and novelty music, agreed to sign them. Martin turned out to be the perfect collaborator, a trained classical musician with the technical skill to translate the band's raw energy into studio recordings that were both experimental and commercially explosive. Within 12 months, the Beatles had the #1 single in Britain. Within 24 months, they had conquered America. By the end of the decade, they had sold over 600 million records. Rowe partially redeemed himself in 1963 by signing the Rolling Stones, reportedly on a recommendation from George Harrison himself. But the Decca rejection endures because it crystallizes a universal pattern in gatekeeping. The people whose job is to spot talent are often the worst at recognizing it when it does not look like what already exists. Rowe was not incompetent. He was applying yesterday's pattern recognition to tomorrow's phenomenon. Guitar groups were on the way out. The Beatles were not a guitar group. They were something that had no category yet, and that is precisely why a man paid to spot the next big thing could not see them standing right in front of him. New Coke launch. In April 1985, the Coca-Cola company did something that no sane observer thought possible. It killed the most popular soft drink on earth. Deliberately. Based on data. 200,000 blind taste tests showed that consumers preferred a sweeter formula over the original Coca-Cola. The research was overwhelming. The decision was unanimous. The data was correct. And it was the worst product launch in American corporate history. Pepsi had been gaining market share for years through the Pepsi Challenge. A simple blind taste test where participants consistently chose Pepsi's sweeter flavor over Coke's sharper bite when given small sips. Coca-Cola's own internal testing confirmed the result. Their labs developed a new, sweeter formula and ran what was, at the time, the largest consumer taste test ever conducted. Nearly 200,000 participants preferred New Coke to both the original formula and to Pepsi. Chief Executive Officer Roberto Goizueta, backed by what looked like an unassailable wall of evidence, announced on April 23rd that the original recipe was being retired permanently. The reaction was not displeasure. It was rage. Coca-Cola's consumer hotline received over 400,000 calls. Protest groups organized in multiple cities. People in the American South, where Coke occupied a position closer to cultural identity than beverage preference, stockpiled the old formula. A man in San Antonio bought over $1,000 worth of original Coke the day before the switch. Psychiatrist hired by Coca-Cola to listen to the hotline calls compared the emotional tenor to grief counseling sessions. People were not complaining about flavor. They were mourning something they felt had been taken from them. Coca-Cola brought back the original formula as Coca-Cola Classic on July 11th, 79 days after the switch. Sales of Classic immediately surged past pre-launch levels. Some observers accused the company of orchestrating the entire fiasco as a marketing stunt, which Goizueta denied. The real failure was subtler and more interesting. The taste tests measured one variable, flavor preference in a controlled sip, and extrapolated it to a conclusion about brand loyalty, emotional attachment, cultural meaning, and decades of personal memory. 200,000 data points told Coca-Cola exactly what people's taste buds preferred. Not one of those data points measured what Coca-Cola actually meant to the people who drank it. 614,000 soldiers crossed the Niemen River into Russia on June 24, 1812. It was the largest army Europe had ever assembled, drawn from France, Italy, Poland, Bavaria, Prussia, Austria, and a dozen other states under Napoleon's control or influence. Fewer than 100,000 would make it back. Napoleon Bonaparte, the most brilliant military mind of his generation, marched his men into a country that simply refused to play the game he was designed to win. Napoleon needed a decisive battle. His entire strategic genius depended on concentrating overwhelming force at a single point and destroying the enemy army in one climactic engagement. The Russians understood this and denied it to him. Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration retreated eastward, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, poisoning wells, and leaving nothing behind. The French advanced through a landscape stripped of food, forage, and shelter. Supply wagons could not keep pace across roads that were alternately muddy and frozen. Horses died by the tens of thousands from lack of fodder. Dysentery, typhus, and exhaustion killed soldiers faster than any Russian bullet. Napoleon lost a third of his army before the first major battle was even fought. That battle came at Borodino on September 7th. It was a grinding frontal bloodbath with no flanking maneuvers and no finesse. Over 70,000 men fell in a single day, making it the deadliest 24 hours of the entire Napoleonic era. Both armies were shattered, but neither was destroyed. Napoleon took Moscow a week later and found it empty. The population had been evacuated. Fires, likely set deliberately, consumed large sections of the city. Napoleon sat in the ruins of the Kremlin for 5 weeks, waiting for Tsar Alexander I to send a surrender offer. Alexander sent nothing. He simply refused to negotiate. With winter closing in and his army starving, Napoleon ordered the retreat on October 19th. What followed was one of the great death marches in military history. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. Men froze solid overnight, where they collapsed. Cossack cavalry harassed the retreating columns daily. At the Berezina River crossing in late November, thousands drowned or were crushed in the chaotic scramble over makeshift bridges under enemy fire. Napoleon eventually abandoned what was left of his army and raced back to Paris in a sleigh. The invasion of Russia did not just fail. It destroyed the instrument of French military power that had taken 15 years to build and set the stage for Napoleon's abdication less than 2 years later. Hitler invading Russia. You would think that the most famous military disaster in European history would have discouraged the next guy from trying the same thing. 129 years after Napoleon watched his army freeze and starve across the Russian steppe, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa with over 3 million soldiers along an 1,800-mile front. He expected the Soviet Union to collapse within 6 weeks. The war on the Eastern Front lasted 3 years and 10 months, killed roughly 30 million people, and became the most destructive military campaign in recorded human history. The early months were devastating for the Soviets. German forces advanced with stunning speed, encircling entire Soviet army groups and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Kiev fell. Leningrad was surrounded. By December 1941, Wehrmacht units were close enough to Moscow to see the Kremlin's spires through field glasses. Soviet losses in the first 5 months exceeded 4.5 million casualties. Hitler and his generals were so confident of imminent victory that they had not bothered equipping the army for winter operations. Soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms in November. Winter came, and the war changed. Temperatures around Moscow plunged to 40 below zero. Weapons jammed. Engine oil froze solid. Frostbite incapacitated tens of thousands of German soldiers. The Soviets, meanwhile, brought in fresh Siberian divisions equipped with white camouflage, felt-lined boots, and weapons lubricated with oils rated for Arctic conditions. The Moscow counteroffensive in December 1941 smashed the German line and ended the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. But it was only the beginning. Ahead lay Stalingrad, where over 2 million people would die in a single battle lasting 5 months. Ahead lay Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history. Ahead lay 3 more years of industrial-scale killing. The final accounting is almost incomprehensible. The Soviet Union lost between 26 and 27 million people, roughly 14% of its entire pre-war population. German military dead on the Eastern Front exceeded 4 million. Cities were leveled. Entire populations were displaced. The Holocaust, which unfolded in parallel across the occupied territories, added millions more to the toll. Hitler repeated every strategic error Napoleon had made and added new ones. He split his forces across multiple objectives instead of concentrating on one. He forbade tactical retreats, leaving units in exposed positions until they were annihilated. He dismissed intelligence reports that contradicted his assumptions. The Eastern Front consumed Nazi Germany the way Russia had consumed the Grande Armée, slowly, relentlessly, and with a bottomless tolerance for suffering that the invader could not match. Gallipoli Campaign. Winston Churchill had a theory. If the Allies could force a fleet through the Dardanelles Strait, capture Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of World War I, a supply route to Russia would open and the entire strategic balance of the war would shift. The theory had real merit. The execution was a catastrophe. Nearly 500,000 Allied soldiers were committed to a narrow Turkish peninsula where they spent 8 months achieving nothing except dying at a scale that traumatized two nations into creating a new national identity around the grief. The naval attempt came first in February and March of 1915. A combined British and French fleet tried to push through the strait and was savaged by Ottoman mines and shore batteries. 3 battleships were sunk in a single day, and 3 more were crippled. Rather than accepting that the naval approach had failed, the planners escalated. A ground invasion was ordered instead. The logic was that troops could seize the peninsula overlooking the strait and silence the Turkish guns from land. No one adequately considered the terrain. On April 25th, Australian, New Zealand, British and French forces landed on several beaches under murderous fire. The geography was nightmarish. Steep cliffs rose directly from the shoreline. Narrow gullies funneled attackers into kill zones. The Ottoman defenders, commanded by Mustafa Kemal, the officer who would later found the modern Turkish Republic, held the high ground and fought with a ferocity that stunned the Allied command. The invading forces never advanced more than a few miles inland. For 8 months, soldiers lived in trenches so close to Ottoman positions that they could hear the enemy talking. Disease killed more men than bullets. Dysentery was so widespread that entire battalions were rendered combat ineffective by diarrhea alone. The Allies evacuated between December 1915 and January 1916. The withdrawal, ironically, was the only phase of the campaign executed with genuine competence. Over 130,000 Allied soldiers died or succumbed to disease. Ottoman casualties were comparable. Nothing was captured, nothing was gained. Churchill was removed from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty and spent years in political exile. For Australia and New Zealand, whose combined 11,000 dead represented a staggering loss for nations with small populations, Gallipoli became the foundational national trauma. April 25th is commemorated annually as Anzac Day, a memorial not to victory, but to the moment when 2 young countries discovered that imperial loyalty could mean dying on a foreign beach for someone else's miscalculation. Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA spent over a year training 1,400 Cuban exiles at secret camps in Guatemala, armed them with American weapons, put them on boats, landed them on a beach in southern Cuba, and expected them to overthrow Fidel Castro's government in a matter of days. The operation collapsed in 72 hours. It succeeded only in humiliating the United States, strengthening Castro domestically, pushing Cuba decisively into the Soviet orbit, and setting the stage for the nuclear confrontation that nearly ended the world 18 months later. The plan originated under Eisenhower and was inherited by John F. Kennedy when he took office in January 1961. The concept was straightforward on paper. Brigade 2506 would land at the Bay of Pigs, establish a beachhead, broadcast calls for a popular uprising and either topple Castro directly or establish a provisional government that the United States could recognize. Kennedy approved the plan, but made critical modifications. He cancelled a second round of airstrikes meant to destroy the remainder of Castro's air force, worried that overt American involvement would be too obvious. This decision left Castro with functioning aircraft that would prove decisive. On April 17th, the brigade hit the beach, and reality hit back immediately. Cuban intelligence already knew the operation was coming. Castro had placed agents inside the exile community in Miami. His air force, which was supposed to have been neutralized, attacked the landing fleet and sank 2 supply ships carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and communications equipment. The popular uprising never materialized. Ordinary Cubans did not rise up against Castro. If anything, the invasion rallied nationalist sentiment in his favor. Castro personally directed the counterattack with roughly 20,000 troops and crushed the brigade within 3 days. Over 100 brigade members were killed. Nearly 1,200 were captured and paraded on Cuban television. Castro eventually ransomed them back to the United States for $53 million in food and medical supplies. Kennedy was publicly furious at the CIA and privately devastated. He reportedly told an advisor he wanted to splinter the agency into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. He did not. What actually happened was worse than a botched invasion. The Bay of Pigs convinced Nikita Khrushchev that Kennedy was young and weak, which directly influenced the Soviet decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba the following year. One failed covert operation, conceived under one president and executed under another, produced the closest the Cold War ever came to turning hot. Vietnam War Escalation. Here is what the Pentagon Papers revealed when they were leaked in 1971. Senior American officials across multiple administrations had known for years that the war in Vietnam was not going well, that the South Vietnamese government was corrupt and unstable, that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were unlikely to be defeated by military force, and that the public was being systematically lied to about all of it. The war continued anyway. It continued for 20 years, cost over $800 billion inflation-adjusted dollars, and killed 58,220 Americans, along with an estimated 1.5 to 3.6 million Vietnamese. American involvement escalated in stages, each one presented as necessary and temporary. Eisenhower sent military advisors in the 50s. Kennedy increased their numbers to over 16,000. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, when North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked an American destroyer. The second alleged attack almost certainly did not happen, but Lyndon Johnson used it to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress, granting him essentially unlimited authority to wage war without a formal declaration. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were deployed in Vietnam, and the Air Force was dropping more bomb tonnage on the country than the Allies had dropped in all of World War II combined. The fundamental problem was structural, and no amount of firepower could solve it. The United States was fighting a conventional war against a guerrilla insurgency with deep popular support. The Viet Cong lived among the civilian population, used tunnel networks stretching hundreds of miles, and received continuous resupply from the north via the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. The South Vietnamese government, the entity America was supposedly defending, was corrupt, authoritarian, and so unpopular that its own military staged repeated coups against its own leadership. American soldiers found themselves killing people to protect a government those people did not want. The war ended on April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. Helicopters evacuated the last Americans from the embassy roof in one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. The environmental destruction was immense. Agent Orange, a herbicide sprayed across millions of acres of forest, caused cancer and birth defects in Vietnamese civilians and American veterans for decades. Unexploded ordnance still kills people in Vietnam today. The draft created a generation of reluctant soldiers who came home to hostility rather than gratitude and struggled with trauma that the Veterans Administration was unequipped to treat. Every lesson Vietnam offered about the limits of military intervention in civil conflicts was available in real time. Most of those lessons were systematically ignored again within a generation. Iraq. WMD Intelligence. On February 5, 2003, Colin Powell sat before the United Nations Security Council holding a small vial of white powder. It was a prop, meant to represent anthrax, meant to make the threat feel tangible. Behind him, aides displayed satellite photographs and diagrams of what the CIA claimed were mobile biological weapons laboratories. Powell, a retired four-star general and one of the most trusted public figures in America, spent 76 minutes presenting the case that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. The weapons did not exist. They had not existed for years. And the war that followed Powell's presentation killed hundreds of thousands of people. The intelligence was not just wrong, it was constructed to support a conclusion that had already been reached. A key source, an Iraqi defector codenamed Curveball, had fabricated his accounts of mobile bioweapons labs. German intelligence, which had primary access to Curveball, warned the CIA that he was unreliable and possibly a fabricator. The warning was noted and disregarded. Claims that Iraq had sought to purchase yellowcake uranium from Niger were based on documents that turned out to be crude forgeries. The aluminum tubes cited as evidence of a centrifuge program were assessed by the Department of Energy's own experts as unsuitable for uranium enrichment. Dissenting views existed within the intelligence community. They were buried in footnotes and appendices where policymakers would not have to confront them. The invasion began on March 20, 2003. Baghdad fell in 3 weeks. The military victory was swift and efficient. Then came the occupation, and everything collapsed. Coalition Provisional Authority head Paul Bremer dissolved the Iraqi army, putting hundreds of thousands of armed, trained, and now unemployed men on the street with no income and a deep grievance. The insurgency that followed was brutal and protracted. Sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia communities spiraled into something close to civil war. No weapons of mass destruction were found. The Iraq Survey Group, tasked specifically with locating them, concluded in 2004 that Iraq had dismantled its programs years earlier. Estimates of Iraqi civilian deaths range from 150,000 to well over 500,000, depending on methodology and time horizon. Over 4,500 American service members were killed. The war's direct costs exceeded $2 trillion. Its regional consequences include the destabilization of Iraq, the rise of ISIS, the empowerment of Iran, and a refugee crisis that reached into Europe. Colin Powell later called his UN presentation a blot on his record that would follow him to the grave. It did. He died in October 2021. The intelligence failure was not an honest mistake by well-meaning analysts. It was a system in which the desired conclusion was set first, and the evidence was assembled afterward, with inconvenient contradictions discarded along the way. Treaty of Versailles. The men who wrote the treaty that ended World War I set out to build a peace that would last forever. It lasted 20 years. The terms they imposed on Germany were so punishing, so humiliating, and so economically devastating that they created the exact conditions needed for a vengeful demagogue to rise to power and start a war that killed 60 million people. The Treaty of Versailles did not prevent World War II. It manufactured the raw materials for it. Signed on June 28, 1919, the treaty forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war under Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. Territorial losses stripped the country of 13% of its land and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Parts of eastern Germany went to the newly reconstituted Poland. The military was limited to 100,000 soldiers. No air force, no submarines, no tanks. Most devastating were the reparations, initially set at 132 billion gold marks, a figure equivalent to roughly $440 billion today. The intent was to make Germany pay for the war in a literal financial sense. The effect was to crush the German economy. By 1923, hyperinflation had made the German mark essentially worthless. Prices doubled every few days. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion by November. Workers were paid twice daily, so they could rush out and spend their wages before the money lost more value. Savings that had taken lifetimes to accumulate evaporated overnight. The middle class was obliterated. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democratic experiment, struggled to maintain legitimacy while its citizens queued for bread with wheelbarrows full of banknotes that could not buy a meal. Adolf Hitler built his political career almost entirely on the rage that Versailles created. The treaty gave him a simple, emotionally devastating narrative. Germany had been betrayed by its own politicians, stabbed in the back, humiliated by foreign powers, and robbed of its rightful place in Europe. That narrative resonated because the economic suffering was visible in every household, and the shame of the War Guilt Clause burned in the national psyche. French Premier Georges Clemenceau had wanted Germany punished so severely it could never threaten France again. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who commanded the Allied armies, looked at the treaty and said the opposite. "This is not peace," he observed. "It is an armistice for 20 years." He was off by 65 days. Treaty of Versailles. The men who wrote the treaty that ended World War I set out to build a peace that would last forever. It lasted 20 years. The terms they imposed on Germany were so punishing, so humiliating, and so economically devastating that they created the exact conditions needed for a vengeful demagogue to rise to power and start a war that killed 60 million people. The Treaty of Versailles did not prevent World War II. It manufactured the raw materials for it. Signed on June 28, 1919, the treaty forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war under Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. Territorial losses stripped the country of 13% of its land and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Parts of eastern Germany went to the newly reconstituted Poland. The military was limited to 100,000 soldiers. No air force, no submarines, no tanks. Most devastating were the reparations, initially set at 132 billion gold marks, a figure equivalent to roughly $440 billion today. The intent was to make Germany pay for the war in a literal financial sense. The effect was to crush the German economy. By 1923, hyperinflation had made the German mark essentially worthless. Prices doubled every few days. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion by November. Workers were paid twice daily so they could rush out and spend their wages before the money lost more value. Savings that had taken lifetimes to accumulate evaporated overnight. The middle class was obliterated. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democratic experiment, struggled to maintain legitimacy while its citizens queued for bread with wheelbarrows full of banknotes that could not buy a meal. Adolf Hitler built his political career almost entirely on the rage that Versailles created. The treaty gave him a simple, emotionally devastating narrative. Germany had been betrayed by its own politicians, stabbed in the back, humiliated by foreign powers, and robbed of its rightful place in Europe. That narrative resonated because the economic suffering was visible in every household, and the shame of the war guilt clause burned in the national psyche. French Premier Georges Clemenceau had wanted Germany punished so severely it could never threaten France again. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who commanded the Allied armies, looked at the treaty and said the opposite. "This is not peace," he observed. "It is an armistice for 20 years. He was off by 65 days. Maginot Line strategy. France spent the modern equivalent of over $3 billion and nearly a decade of construction building the most sophisticated system of fixed fortifications in military history. Concrete bunkers, artillery casemates, anti-tank obstacles, underground railways, barracks, hospitals, and ammunition depots stretched along the Franco-German border from Switzerland to Luxembourg. It was designed to make a German invasion through the border impossible. Germany drove around it in 10 days. The Maginot Line was the brainchild of War Minister André Maginot, himself severely wounded at Verdun during the First World War. The logic was defensive and, on its own terms, sound. France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers in that war. The country could not sustain another frontal slugging match with Germany. Fortifications along the border would channel any future German attack away from French territory and into Belgium, where it could be met by mobile forces on more favourable terms. On paper, the strategy acknowledged a real vulnerability and proposed a rational response. The fatal flaw was in the assumption. French military planners believed the Ardennes forest in southeastern Belgium was impassable to armoured formations. The terrain was dense, hilly, and crisscrossed with narrow roads. No responsible strategist would route a tank assault through it. On May 10, 1940, that is exactly what Germany did. 7 panzer divisions, concentrated into a narrow armoured spearhead designed by General Erich von Manstein, punched through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse River in 3 days, and broke into open country behind the Allied lines. Within 2 weeks, German forces had reached the English Channel, cutting off the entire Allied Northern Army group. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk. France surrendered on June 22nd, 6 weeks after the invasion began. The Maginot Line garrisons, still undefeated and fully supplied, were ordered to lay down their arms. Not a single fortification had been breached. The billions of francs, the years of engineering, the thousands of gun emplacements, all rendered irrelevant by an enemy who chose a path the defenders had dismissed as impossible. The Maginot Line has become permanent shorthand for a specific kind of strategic failure. It is what happens when you prepare exhaustively for a threat you understand while remaining blind to the possibility that your enemy might not cooperate with your assumptions. Charge of the Light Brigade, 673 men on horseback, rode directly into a valley with Russian cannons on 3 sides because of a vague hand gesture, a badly written order, and an officer too proud to ask for clarification. Within 20 minutes, Over 200 were dead or wounded, and most of their horses were destroyed. The charge accomplished nothing. It became the most famous cavalry action in history, not because it was brave, though it was, but because it was so spectacularly, pointlessly futile that a poet turned it into a monument to obedient stupidity. The Battle of Balaclava, October 25th, 1854. The Crimean War. British commander Lord Raglan, watching from a hilltop, saw Russian troops attempting to drag away captured British guns from a position on a nearby ridge. He dictated an order to Lord Lucan, the cavalry division commander on the valley floor, instructing him to advance rapidly and prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns. From Raglan's elevation, the intended target was obvious. From Lucan's position in the valley, it was not. The only guns Lucan could see were a Russian battery at the far end of a long, exposed valley, flanked by cannon positions on both sides. Captain Lewis Nolan delivered the order and grew impatient with Lucan's hesitation. When Lucan asked which guns he was supposed to attack, Nolan waved his arm in a direction that could have indicated the hilltop or the valley. Accounts differ on exactly what he said and where he pointed. What is certain is that Lucan interpreted the order as a command to charge directly down the valley into the teeth of the Russian battery. He passed the order to Lord Cardigan, who commanded the Light Brigade. Cardigan knew the charge was suicide. He said so. Then he drew his sword and led it anyway, because the order came from above, and questioning it further was not something a Victorian aristocrat did. The brigade rode through concentrated cannon fire from front and flanks for over a mile. They actually reached the Russian guns, briefly engaged the gunners, and then retreated back through the same crossfire. 110 men were killed. 160 more were wounded. 375 horses died. French Marshal Pierre Bosquet, watching from a nearby position, said it was magnificent, but it was not war. Tennyson's poem immortalized the 600 as heroes of unquestioning duty. The less romantic reading is that 3 aristocrats with purchase commissions and zero mutual respect killed 200 men because none of them could bring himself to say, "I do not understand the order. Can you say it again more clearly?" Signing away Manhattan. In 1626, Peter Minuit of the Dutch West India Company reportedly traded 60 guilders worth of goods to the Lenape people for the island of Manhattan. Adjusted for inflation, 60 guilders is roughly $1,000. Manhattan real estate is currently valued at over $1.7 trillion. The gap between those two numbers makes it the most cited bad deal in history, but the story people tell about it is almost entirely wrong. The Lenape did not have the European concept of permanent exclusive land ownership. To them, land was not a commodity to be sold. The transaction, to whatever extent it actually happened as described, was almost certainly understood by the Lenape as a kind of shared use agreement, permission for the Dutch to coexist on the island. They had no framework for the idea that accepting trade goods meant surrendering their homeland forever. Some historians have questioned whether the Lenape group Minuit dealt with even had territorial authority over the full island, suggesting the agreement may have been made with a band that was passing through, or that controlled only a portion of the area. None of these subtleties mattered to the Dutch, who treated the exchange as a completed purchase under European law and began building. Fort Amsterdam went up at the southern tip. Warehouses and houses followed. The settlement of New Amsterdam became a trading hub for furs, timber, and agricultural goods. When the English seized the colony in 1664, without a fight, they renamed it New York and inherited the infrastructure the Dutch had built. Over the next 3.5 centuries, that muddy island at the mouth of the Hudson River became the financial capital of the world, home to Wall Street, the United Nations, Central Park, and some of the most valuable real estate ever developed. The Manhattan Purchase endures in pop culture because the price is so absurd. But treating it as a bad deal by the Lenape misses the deeper ugliness. It was not a deal at all, not in any meaningful bilateral sense. It was one side imposing its legal framework on another side that did not share it, using goods of marginal value to establish a claim that would be enforced by military power whenever the original inhabitants objected. The same pattern repeated across the entire continent for the next 2 centuries. Manhattan is simply the most famous example of a system designed to convert other people's land into your property using the thinnest possible fiction of consent. Thalidomide drug disaster. The babies were born without arms, without legs, with shortened flipper-like limbs that had no fingers, with damaged hearts, kidneys, and intestinal tracts. Over 10,000 of them, in 46 countries, before anyone connected the deformities to a mild, over-the-counter sedative that doctors had been handing pregnant women for morning sickness and telling them it was completely safe. Thalidomide was synthesized by the West German pharmaceutical company Chemie Grünenthal and brought to market in 1957. It was promoted as non-toxic, non-addictive, and ideal for pregnant women experiencing nausea. The marketing was aggressive, and the claims were confident. Animal reproductive testing had been minimal. The drug was never tested on pregnant animals before release. It was sold under different brand names in different countries, making it harder to track adverse effects across borders. By 1960, thalidomide was available in over 40 countries. Doctors prescribed it freely. It was, by all advertised accounts, one of the safest drugs on the shelf. In late 1961, 2 physicians working independently on opposite sides of the world made the connection. Australian obstetrician William McBride and German paediatrician Widukind Lenz both identified thalidomide as the cause of a surge in phocomelia, a condition where limbs fail to develop in utero. The drug was withdrawn from market in most countries by the end of that year. But the damage was done. An estimated 10,000 children had been born with thalidomide-related deformities. Roughly 40% died in infancy. Survivors faced lifetimes of physical limitation in an era when disability services ranged from inadequate to cruel. Many were institutionalized. The United States was largely spared, and the reason is one person. Francis Oldham Kelsey, a pharmacologist at the FDA, refused to approve thalidomide for the American market. The drug's distributor, a company called Richardson Merrill, pressured her relentlessly. She kept asking for more safety data. They kept failing to provide it. Kelsey delayed approval for over a year, and by the time the disaster became public, her stubbornness had prevented the drug from reaching American pharmacies. Kennedy awarded her the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in 1962, requiring drugs to be proven both safe and effective before reaching patients. Pharmaceutical regulation worldwide was rewritten because one woman decided that annoying a drug company was less important than protecting pregnant women from a pill that nobody had bothered to properly test. Leaded gasoline invention. Thomas Migley Jr. might be the most destructive individual organism in the history of the planet. That is not hyperbole. Environmental historian J.R. McNeill actually wrote that in a published academic work. In 1921, working as an engineer at General Motors, Midgley discovered that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline eliminated engine knock. The automotive industry embraced his discovery. Over the next 70 years, the lead pumped from tailpipes poisoned virtually every human being alive and may have permanently lowered the cognitive capacity of an entire generation. The toxicity of lead was not a secret. It had been documented since Roman times. Workers at the first tetraethyl lead production facilities in the 1920s developed obvious and horrifying symptoms. At a Standard Oil refinery in Bayway, New Jersey, 5 workers died and 35 were hospitalized with acute lead poisoning in a single week in 1924. The facility was nicknamed the Looney Gas Building because workers would hallucinate, become violently delirious, and collapse. Migley himself took a leave of absence from the project due to lead poisoning. GM and Standard Oil temporarily halted production, then resumed after an industry-funded review panel concluded that there was no reason to ban the additive. From the 20s through the 70s, billions of tons of lead particulate were dispersed globally through automobile exhaust. Lead does not degrade. It accumulated in soil, water, air, and human tissue. Children were especially vulnerable. Even low-level exposure permanently damages developing brains, reducing IQ, impairing impulse control, increasing aggression, and degrading attention span. Economist Rick Nevin published a landmark study showing a remarkably tight statistical correlation between childhood lead exposure rates and violent crime rates 20 years later. The pattern held across multiple countries. When leaded gasoline was phased out, crime rates dropped everywhere, with about a 2-decade lag. The United States began the phase-out in 1973 and banned leaded gasoline for road vehicles in 1996. Many developing nations took decades longer. Algeria, the last holdout, banned it in 2021. The total damage is incalculable. Hundreds of millions of people were exposed to a neurotoxin during their most developmentally critical years. The global average IQ may have been measurably suppressed for half a century. And Migley, the man responsible, also invented chlorofluorocarbons, the chemicals that tore a hole in the ozone layer. One engineer, 2 global environmental catastrophes. He strangled himself accidentally at age 55 with a pulley system he had designed to help him out of bed after contracting polio. Even his death involved an invention that backfired. CFCs destroying the ozone. Thomas Migley again. In 1928, 7 years after putting lead in gasoline, he invented chlorofluorocarbons as a safe replacement for the toxic refrigerants that were leaking from early cooling systems and occasionally killing people. Ammonia and sulfur dioxide were the standard refrigerants of the era, and both were genuinely dangerous in enclosed spaces. Migley's new compounds were stable, non-toxic, non-flammable, and odorless. They seem like one of the great chemical achievements of the 20th century. They also happen to destroy the thin atmospheric layer protecting all life on Earth from ultraviolet radiation. CFCs were adopted rapidly across multiple industries. Refrigerators, air conditioners, aerosol spray cans, and foam insulation all use them. By the 1970s, hundreds of thousands of tons of CFCs were being released into the atmosphere annually. At ground level, they were harmless. But CFCs are extraordinarily stable molecules. They do not break down in the lower atmosphere. Instead, they drift upward into the stratosphere, where intense ultraviolet radiation finally splits them apart, releasing chlorine atoms. Each chlorine atom then destroys ozone molecules through a catalytic chain reaction. A single chlorine atom can eliminate thousands of ozone molecules before it is finally neutralized. In 1974, chemists Mario Molina and Frank Sherwood Rowland published the theoretical prediction that CFCs could deplete stratospheric ozone. The chemical industry responded with denial, lobbying, and funded counter-research, a playbook that would become familiar in subsequent decades. Then, in 1985, scientists from the British Antarctic Survey published direct observational evidence. A massive thinning of the ozone layer over Antarctica was reappearing each spring and growing. At its worst extent, the ozone hole covered an area larger than North America. Increased ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface meant rising rates of skin cancer, cataracts, and ecosystem damage to marine organisms and agriculture. The Montreal Protocol, signed in 1987, committed nations to phasing out CFC production. It is widely considered the most successful international environmental agreement ever enacted. CFC concentrations in the atmosphere have been declining since the mid-90s, and the ozone layer is slowly healing, though full recovery is not expected until roughly 2066. The story is remarkable for being one of the few cases where humanity identified a planetary-scale fuck-up, agreed on a solution, and actually followed through. But it took over a decade of denial between the first scientific warnings and meaningful action, and the whole got significantly worse during that delay. Speed matters when the thing you are slowly destroying is the shield between the sun and everything alive. Asbestos. In 1935, executives at Johns Manville, the largest asbestos manufacturer in the world, received internal medical reports documenting clear evidence that asbestos fibers were causing lung disease and death among their workers. Their corporate attorneys reviewed the findings and recommended a course of action. Not disclosure, not safety improvements, suppression. The company buried the data and continued selling asbestos for another 50 years, knowing it was killing the people who mined it, installed it, and lived in buildings insulated with it. Asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral fiber prized for its extraordinary resistance to heat, fire, and chemical corrosion. It was woven into construction materials, ship insulation, brake pads, roofing shingles, floor tiles, and thousands of consumer products. When asbestos fibers are disturbed and inhaled, they lodge in lung tissue permanently. The body cannot expel them. Over periods of 20 to 50 years, they cause asbestosis, a progressive scarring disease that slowly suffocates the patient, and mesothelioma, an aggressive cancer of the lung lining that is nearly always fatal and has no effective treatment. The decades-long latency period between exposure and symptoms made the connection easy to obscure, and the industry exploited that delay ruthlessly. The cover-up was coordinated and industry-wide. Companies funded research designed to produce favorable conclusions. They attacked independent scientists who published damaging findings. They lobbied against workplace regulations. They did not tell workers about the risks. Families living near asbestos mines were exposed without knowledge or consent. Internal documents from multiple manufacturers, uncovered during litigation, show executives explicitly discussing the dangers of their product and explicitly deciding to conceal those dangers to protect revenue. The calculation was not subtle, it was direct. Sick workers were a cost. Dead workers were a liability. Informed workers were a threat. Asbestos-related diseases currently kill roughly 90,000 people worldwide every year. Over 60 countries have banned the material entirely. The United States, as of 2025, still has not enacted a complete ban. Litigation against asbestos manufacturers has generated over $30 billion in judgments and settlements, making it the longest-running mass tort in American legal history. Many of the responsible companies declared strategic bankruptcies to cap their exposure, setting up trust funds that pay victims pennies on the dollar. The executives who made the decision to suppress the evidence in 1935 are long dead. The workers they chose not to warn are still dying. Tobacco industry cover-up. In December 1953, the chief executives of the 6 largest American tobacco companies gathered at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. They had a problem. Accumulating scientific research was linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer, and the findings were getting harder to ignore. The executives did not dispute the science among themselves. They knew. What they decided at that meeting was not to investigate further or to warn consumers. They decided to construct one of the most sophisticated disinformation campaigns in corporate history, one that would successfully delay meaningful regulation for over 4 decades. The tobacco companies hired Hill and Knowlton, one of the most powerful public relations firms in the country, to create the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. Despite its name, the organization's purpose was not research. It was the manufacturing of doubt. The strategy, articulated explicitly in internal documents, was never to prove that cigarettes were safe. That was impossible. Instead, the goal was to keep the scientific question technically open, to fund studies that muddied the waters, to promote fringe findings that contradicted the consensus, and to shift public perception from certainty to confusion. If people believed the science was still debatable, regulation could be delayed indefinitely, and it worked, for decades. On April 14, 1994, the CEOs of 7 major tobacco companies stood before a congressional subcommittee, raised their right hands, and each testified under oath that they believed nicotine was not addictive. Internal company documents, many of which were later obtained through litigation and whistleblowers, proved they knew the opposite. Philip Morris researchers had studied nicotine's addictive properties in detail. R.J. Reynolds' internal memos discuss strategies for manipulating nicotine delivery to keep smokers dependent. Jeffrey Wigand, a former vice president of research at Brown and Williamson, eventually broke his non-disclosure agreement and told the full story to the press and to federal investigators. Smoking kills approximately 8 million people worldwide every year. In the United States alone, tobacco use accounts for over 480,000 deaths annually. The Master Settlement Agreement of 1998 required tobacco companies to pay states over $206 billion across 25 years. The companies remain profitable. The playbook they pioneered, manufacturing doubt, funding sympathetic research, attacking independent science, lobbying against regulation, and publicly professing ignorance they did not possess, was subsequently adopted by the fossil fuel industry on climate change, by opioid manufacturers on addiction, and by any corporation that found it cheaper to dispute science than to change its product. The tobacco industry did not just sell cigarettes. It invented the modern template for profitable denial. Exxon Valdez spill. Captain Joseph Hazelwood had a documented history of alcohol problems. Exxon knew about it. He had been through rehab. His driver's license had been revoked for drunk driving. He remained in command of a supertanker carrying 53 million gallons of crude oil through the narrow, reef-studded waters of Prince William Sound, Alaska. Shortly after midnight, on March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez ran aground on Bligh Reef and tore open its hull. Hazelwood was below deck at the time. 11 million gallons of crude poured into one of the most ecologically pristine marine environments on the planet. Hazelwood had left the bridge and put third mate Gregory Cousins in charge of navigating the outbound shipping lane. Cousins was finishing an extended shift and was exhausted. The ship had departed from the normal sea lane to avoid icebergs carved from the Columbia Glacier, and Cousins needed to execute a turn back into the lane while threading between the glacier ice and Bligh Reef. The ship's radar, which could have provided early warning, had been broken for over a year. Exxon had not prioritized the repair. Cousins missed the turn. At 12:04 a.m., the tanker's hull scraped across the reef, rupturing 8 of its 11 cargo tanks. The oil spread across Prince William Sound and beyond, contaminating over 1,300 miles of shoreline. Scientists documented the deaths of over 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 sea otters, 300 harbour seals, 250 bald eagles, and billions of salmon and herring eggs. Those were only the carcasses found and counted. Actual mortality was estimated at many multiples of the recovery numbers. The herring population of Prince William Sound, which supported a multi-million-dollar fishing industry, collapsed and has never fully recovered. Studies conducted 2 decades after the spill still found toxic oil residue beneath surface sediments on beaches that had been declared clean. Exxon spent roughly $2 billion on cleanup and was initially ordered to pay $5 billion in punitive damages. After 2 decades of corporate appeals, the Supreme Court reduced the punitive award to $507 million in 2008. Hazelwood was acquitted of operating the vessel while intoxicated, but convicted of a misdemeanor for negligent discharge of oil. His sentence was 1,000 hours of community service, picking up trash on the Alaska shoreline. The spill led to the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which mandated double-hulled tanker construction. The ecosystem paid for the regulation, with decades of contamination that is still measurable today, and the captain whose drinking helped cause it never spent a day in jail. 3 Mile Island. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island. Nobody was seriously injured. The partial meltdown at the Unit 2 reactor in Pennsylvania on March 28, 1979, released a small amount of radioactive gas, and the maximum radiation dose to any nearby resident was roughly equivalent to a chest X-ray. By any objective safety metric, it was a contained incident. By every other metric, it was the event that killed the American nuclear power industry for an entire generation. The accident started with a stuck valve. A pressure relief valve in the primary coolant system opened automatically during a minor malfunction and failed to close again. Coolant water drained from the reactor vessel, while the control room instruments displayed contradictory information. One indicator showed the valve was shut when it was still open. Operators, misinterpreting the data, concluded the reactor had too much coolant and manually overrode the emergency cooling system. They were doing exactly the opposite of what the situation required. Without adequate cooling, the fuel rods overheated. Roughly half the core melted. Radioactive gas accumulated in the containment building. The next several days were consumed by confusion, contradictory announcements, and mounting public fear. Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburgh ordered a precautionary evacuation of pregnant women and young children within 5 miles. Roughly 140,000 people fled voluntarily from the surrounding area, many convinced a catastrophic explosion was imminent. Media coverage amplified the panic exponentially. The film, The China Syndrome, a thriller about a nuclear meltdown and a corporate cover-up, had opened in theaters exactly 12 days before the accident, priming the public imagination with worst-case nuclear scenarios. No new nuclear power plant was ordered in the United States for over 30 years after 3 Mile Island. More than 50 planned or partially constructed reactors were cancelled. Public approval of nuclear energy cratered and stayed low for decades. The accident occurred at precisely the historical moment when nuclear could have displaced massive quantities of coal-fired electricity generation. the single largest source of carbon dioxide emissions in the power sector. Depending on how you weigh the risks, 3 Mile Island either saved America from nuclear danger or condemned the atmosphere to 3 decades of avoidable fossil fuel emissions because a pressure relief valve got stuck open and the control room instruments told a lie. Space Shuttle Columbia. 17 years after Challenger, NASA made the same mistake. Not a similar mistake, the same one. A known risk was treated as acceptable because it had not yet caused a catastrophe. Engineers who raised alarms were overruled by management, and 7 people died because the institution had learned nothing from the last time it killed 7 people. During Columbia's launch on January 16, 2003, a briefcase-sized chunk of insulating foam broke off the external fuel tank and struck the leading edge of the left wing at roughly 530 miles per hour. The impact punched a hole in the reinforced carbon-carbon panels that protected the wing during the extreme heat of atmospheric re-entry. Foam shedding during launch was not new. It had happened on previous missions. NASA engineers from the debris assessment team identified the strike through video review and spent days analyzing the potential damage. They concluded the risk was serious and formally requested that the Department of Defense use spy satellites or ground-based telescopes to photograph the wing in orbit. Their request was denied. Linda Ham, the mission management team chair, classified the foam strike as a maintenance concern rather than a safety issue. The satellite imaging request was killed before it reached decision makers with the authority to authorize it. When the assessment team pushed back, they were told to stop pursuing the issue. Foam strikes had occurred before without fatal consequences, and within NASA's management culture, that pattern of non-failure was interpreted as evidence of safety rather than evidence of compounding risk. The same reasoning, the same institutional reflex that had treated O-ring erosion as acceptable before Challenger. On February 1st, superheated plasma entered the breach in the wing during re-entry and destroyed the internal structure of the orbiter. Columbia broke apart over Texas at an altitude of over 200,000 feet. All 7 crew members were killed. The debris field stretched across 2 states. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board published a report that read, in places, like a copy of the Challenger investigation from 1986. The language about organizational culture, about the suppression of dissent, about the normalization of risk, was almost interchangeable. 14 people were killed by the same institutional failure, separated by 17 years. Because an organization that sends human beings into space on top of controlled explosions chose twice to treat the people closest to the technical problems as obstacles to the schedule. Boeing 737 MAX design, 346 people died in 2 plane crashes 5 months apart, and the root cause of both was a software system that Boeing did not tell pilots existed. The 737 MAX was not a new airplane, it was a patch, an engineering compromise bolted onto a 50-year-old airframe to avoid the cost and delay of designing something from scratch. Boeing chose speed to market over safety, and the FAA let them grade their own homework. Airbus launched the A320neo in 2010, a fuel-efficient narrow-body jet that threatened Boeing's dominance in the most profitable segment of commercial aviation. Boeing needed a competitive response fast. A clean sheet design would take a decade and cost billions. Instead, they opted to modify the existing 737, a design dating to the 1960s, by fitting it with larger, more efficient LEAP-1B engines. The bigger engines could not fit in the original underwing position, so Boeing mounted them further forward and higher on the wing. This altered the aircraft's aerodynamic behavior, causing the nose to pitch up excessively under certain conditions. To compensate, Boeing installed the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, known as MCAS. This software automatically pushed the nose down when a sensor detected a dangerously high angle of attack. The critical design flaw was that MCAS relied on input from a single sensor with no redundancy. If that sensor fed erroneous data, MCAS would force the nose down repeatedly. Pilots who did not know MCAS existed, because Boeing had deliberately omitted it from training materials and the flight manual, had no effective way to diagnose or override the system in real time. Boeing minimized the significance of MCAS in its communications with the FAA. The FAA, which had increasingly delegated certification authority to Boeing itself, did not independently verify the claims. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea 13 minutes after takeoff from Jakarta. 189 people died. The flight data recorder showed MCAS had activated repeatedly based on a faulty sensor, pushing the nose down while the pilots fought to climb. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 went down 6 minutes after takeoff from Addis Ababa. 157 dead. Same failure pattern, same software, same single point of failure. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide for nearly 2 years. Boeing paid over $2.5 billion in fines and settlements. Every person on those 2 flights was killed by a decision to ship a known aerodynamic problem with a software band-aid, to hide that band-aid from the people flying the plane, and to let the manufacturer certify its own product. Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse. From the day it opened, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge moved. The roadway would rise and fall in rolling waves, sometimes undulating several feet, even in moderate winds. Commuters loved it. They called it Galloping Gertie and drove across specifically for the roller coaster sensation. Engineers were less amused. They installed cable stays and hydraulic dampers to reduce the motion. Nothing worked. On November 7th, 1940, 4 months and 7 days after opening, a sustained 42-mile-per-hour wind set the bridge into oscillations so violent that the roadway twisted itself apart and collapsed into Puget Sound, while a film camera captured the entire thing. The bridge was the 3rd longest suspension span in the world when it opened on July 1st, 1940. Designer Leon Moisseiff had prioritized aesthetic elegance, creating a deck that was extraordinarily narrow and shallow for its length. The roadway was only 39 feet wide and used solid plate girders along the sides instead of open trusses. This made the bridge look graceful and streamlined. It also turned the deck into a sail. Wind hitting the solid girders had nowhere to go except over and around them, creating vortices that fed energy into the structure rather than allowing it to dissipate. On the morning of the collapse, the wind was steady but not extraordinary. 42 miles per hour is well within the range that any major bridge should withstand. But Galloping Gertie had entered a condition called aeroelastic flutter, a self-reinforcing oscillation where the motion of the structure interacts with the wind in a feedback loop that amplifies rather than dampens. The deck began twisting in a corkscrew motion, one edge rising while the opposite edge fell, with the amplitude growing wider on each cycle. By roughly 11 a.m., the twisting exceeded the structural tolerance of the concrete and steel. A 600-foot section of the center span ripped free and dropped into the water. The rest followed within minutes. The only fatality was a cocker spaniel named Tubby, trapped in a car on the bridge. His owner tried to reach him, but the dog, terrified by the motion, bit the man's hand and refused to be pulled out. The newsreel footage of Galloping Gertie's final minutes became the most widely shown engineering failure film in history. It is still used in civil engineering and physics classrooms worldwide. Every suspension bridge designed after 1940 incorporated wind tunnel testing and open truss deck construction, specifically because of what happened at Tacoma Narrows. The lesson cost 4 months of operation, $7 million in 1940 money, and one terrified dog, which makes it one of the cheapest catastrophic engineering lessons in history relative to the amount of knowledge it produced. Titanic's missing binoculars. The key was in David Blair's pocket. He was not on the ship. Blair had been the Titanic's second officer until a last-minute crew shuffle bumped him from the maiden voyage. He packed his bags, walked off the gangway, and forgot to hand over one small brass key. That key opened the crow's nest locker. Inside the locker were the binoculars assigned to the lookouts. Without them, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spent the night of April 14th, 1912, scanning the Atlantic with their naked eyes across water so calm it had no breaking waves to reveal an iceberg's outline. Fleet saw the berg roughly 500 meters ahead. At 22 knots, that gave the bridge less than 40 seconds. He rang the bell 3 times and phoned down. First Officer Murdoch ordered hard starboard. The ship began to turn. It was not enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard hull below the waterline, popping rivets and opening 6 compartments to the sea. Fleet testified at the British inquiry that binoculars would have given him enough distance to spot the ice sooner. Some maritime experts have argued that binoculars narrow the field of view and might have slowed initial detection. But on a moonless, windless, waveless night, the kind of night where icebergs become invisible until they are right on top of you, range mattered more than field. The binoculars were not the primary cause. The Titanic was running near top speed through a known ice field. Captain Smith had received multiple wireless warnings and pressed on. The ship carried lifeboats for barely half the people on board, because regulations had not kept pace with vessel size. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, may or may not have pressured Smith to maintain speed for a record crossing. Every one of those failures was systemic and institutional. But the key is what haunts people. One small object, forgotten in one pocket, during one routine personnel change. Blair kept it as a memento after the sinking. It sold at auction in 2007 for £90,000. A souvenir of 1,500 deaths, caused in part by the most mundane possible failure. A man walked off a ship and forgot to empty his jacket. Austrian army-friendly fire. An army of 100,000 men fought a pitched battle, suffered an estimated 10,000 casualties, and never encountered a single enemy soldier. The Battle of Karansebes in 1788 is the most absurd military engagement in recorded history. A catastrophe born from schnapps, a language barrier, and the darkest impulse of panicked men, which is to shoot at anything that moves. The Austrian army was camped near Karansebes in modern Romania, preparing for war against the Ottoman Empire. A scouting party of hussars crossed the Timis River looking for Turks and found instead a group of Romani traders selling alcohol. They bought it. They drank it. When infantry soldiers wandered over and demanded their share, the hussars refused. A brawl erupted. Shots were fired. Then someone screamed the word that changed everything. Terci. Turks. The Austrian military was a polyglot empire in uniform. Soldiers spoke German, Hungarian, Czech, Romanian, Italian, Croatian, Serbian, Polish, and more. Officers barking orders in German were incomprehensible to Hungarian infantrymen. The shout of Terci became a cascade of mistranslation and terror. One widely repeated account claims that German officers screaming "halt" were heard by non-German speakers as Allah. Whether or not that specific detail is true, what is documented is that entire regiments began firing blind into the darkness at shapes they assumed were Ottoman attackers. Artillery batteries opened up on their own cavalry. Infantry squares formed and shot at anyone approaching. The chaos fed on itself for hours. By dawn, thousands were dead, wounded, or scattered across the countryside. When the actual Ottoman army arrived 2 days later, they found the position abandoned and took the town without resistance. Historians debate the exact casualty figures because the most dramatic accounts were written decades after the fact. But Austrian military records confirm the core absurdity. An army that outnumbered its actual enemy got drunk, panicked, and tore itself apart before the fighting even started. The Ottomans did not need to defeat the Austrians. The Austrians did it for them. The math seemed simple. China had too many people. Resources were finite. The population had nearly doubled under Mao, from 540 million to over 960 million in less than 3 decades. Famine was recent memory. So in 1979, the government implemented the most extreme population control measure in modern history, restricting most families to a single child. The policy prevented an estimated 400 million births. It also broke the country's demographic future in ways that cannot be repaired. Enforcement was brutal and varied by region. Fines for unauthorized births could equal years of income. Women were subjected to forced sterilizations and forced abortions, sometimes in the final trimester. Local officials faced career consequences if their districts exceeded quotas, creating an incentive structure that rewarded coercion. Families who complied received better housing, education access, and employment priority. Families who did not were stripped of social services. In rural areas where sons were essential for farm labour and old age support, the policy collided with a deep cultural preference for male heirs. The result was widespread sex-selective abortion, infanticide of baby girls, and abandonment of female newborns. By the early 2000s, China's birth ratio had skewed to roughly 120 boys for every 100 girls. Millions of children born outside the policy were never registered. Called Heihaisi, or black children, they existed without legal identity. No birth certificate, no access to school, healthcare, or formal employment. An entire shadow population, invisible to the state, created by the state's own rules. The psychological toll on a generation raised without siblings in a society that had always centered family life has been studied extensively, but remains difficult to quantify. China abandoned the policy in 2016. Birth rates did not recover. A generation conditioned to small families, facing skyrocketing housing costs and brutal work culture, chose not to have more children even when permitted. China's population peaked in 2022 and is now shrinking. The United Nations projects it could fall below 1 billion by 2100. The workforce is contracting while the elderly population explodes. The one-child policy solved a problem that was already solving itself, because fertility rates were dropping across Asia without coercion, and in doing so, manufactured a demographic time bomb with no known defusal. Mao's Four Pests campaign. Mao Zedong looked at a sparrow eating grain and saw an enemy of the state. In 1958, he ordered the people of China to exterminate every sparrow they could find. Schools closed, factories paused. Hundreds of millions of citizens poured into fields and streets, banging pots, waving flags, shouting, refusing to let sparrows land until the birds dropped dead from exhaustion, mid-flight. It worked. The sparrows died. Then the locusts came. And then somewhere between 15 and 55 million people starved to death. The four-pest campaign targeted rats, flies, mosquitoes and sparrows as part of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's catastrophic plan to vault China from agrarian poverty to industrial power in a single generation. Sparrows made the list because they ate grain seeds, which was framed as stealing food from the people. The mobilization was total. In Beijing alone, roughly 3 million citizens participated in a coordinated 3-day extermination drive. Nests were torn from eaves. Eggs were smashed. Children competed for the highest body counts. The Polish embassy in Beijing, which refused to let the crowds onto its grounds, was surrounded by drummers for 2 straight days until the sparrows sheltering in its trees died of exhaustion. What Mao did not know, or did not care to learn, was that sparrows ate far more insects than grain. They were a keystone predator of locusts and other crop-destroying pests. With the sparrow population demolished, locust populations erupted. Swarms descended on fields already weakened by other Great Leap Forward disasters. Backyard steel furnaces had pulled millions of farmers away from planting and harvesting. Collectivized farming had destroyed generations of local agricultural knowledge. The insect plague was the final blow to a food system already on its knees. The Great Chinese Famine lasted from 1959 to 1961. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 15 million. Demographic research published in recent decades suggests the real number may exceed 45 million. Mao quietly replaced sparrows on the pest list with bedbugs, a tacit admission that the campaign had been a catastrophe. No public accountability followed. The famine was censored domestically for decades. One man decided a bird was the enemy, and a country that could not afford to question him paid for that decision with the worst famine in human history. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was one of the most innovative military minds in Europe. He had pioneered deep battle doctrine, a theory of combined arms warfare that anticipated how every major army would eventually fight. He was 44 years old when Stalin had him arrested, tortured into a false confession, and shot. His blood was literally found on the confession document. Tukhachevsky was the most prominent name in a purge that gutted the Soviet military so thoroughly that when Germany invaded 3 years later, the Red Army was led by men whose primary qualification was that they had survived by never saying anything original. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin executed or imprisoned roughly 35,000 officers, 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, 154 of 186 division commanders. The numbers are so extreme they read as typos. They are not. Stalin's paranoia, sharpened by the assassination of Leningrad Party chief Sergei Kirov in 1934, drove cascading waves of arrests where each tortured confession produced new names, and each new name produced new arrests. Officers denounced colleagues to save themselves. Some denounced colleagues because they wanted their posts. The machinery of terror was self-perpetuating. The survivors learned exactly one lesson: do not think, do not innovate, do not take initiative, follow orders from Moscow, no matter how detached those orders are from reality on the ground. Report only success. An officer who retreated without permission, even to save his unit from encirclement, risked execution. An officer who reported bad news risked being labelled a defeatist, which was a death sentence. The Soviet military became an institution where the safest career move was rigid, unquestioning obedience, which is the precise opposite of what wins wars. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded with 3 million men along an 1,800-mile front. In the first 6 months, the Red Army lost over 4 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Entire army groups were encircled because commanders waited for permission from Moscow to retreat while the Germans closed the ring. Stalin himself appears to have suffered a psychological collapse in the opening days. The Soviet Union survived, but at a cost of 27 million dead, a toll vastly inflated by an officer corps that had been trained, through execution, to value obedience over competence. Stalin destroyed his army's brain to protect himself from imaginary conspirators, then discovered what a brainless army looks like when the real enemy arrives. Burning the Library of Alexandria. We will never know what we lost. That is the thing about the Library of Alexandria that makes it different from every other disaster on this list. When a ship sinks, you can count the dead. When a company fails, you can tally the money. But when the ancient world's greatest collection of knowledge was destroyed, the loss became invisible, because the things that vanished were things no one alive would ever know existed. The library was established in the 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt. At its height, it may have held anywhere from 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls. The range is that wide because we are estimating the size of a collection using sources that survived its destruction. What we do know is that scholars travelled from across the Mediterranean to work there. Euclid wrote his Elements in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there and got it right to within a few percent, over 1,700 years before Columbus sailed. Archimedes studied there. It was not a library in the way we think of one, a quiet building where people borrow books. It was a research institution funded by the state, staffed with scholars, copyists, and translators, the closest ancient equivalent to a modern university. The destruction was not one dramatic fire. That is the myth. The reality was slower and uglier. Caesar's troops accidentally burned a warehouse of scrolls during the siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE. Christian mobs destroyed the affiliated Serapeum Temple in 391 CE on orders from Bishop Theophilus, who viewed pagan texts as threats to the faith. The final decline is traditionally linked to the Muslim conquest in 642 CE, though modern historians dispute the specifics. What is not disputed is the outcome. By the medieval period, the collection was gone. Centuries of war, religious purges, budget cuts, and institutional neglect had bled it dry, scroll by scroll. Here is what that cost. Mathematical proofs that took European scholars 1,000 years to rediscover may have already been sitting on those shelves. Medical texts from Greek and Egyptian physicians, gone. Plays by Sophocles and Euripides that ancient commentators quote from, but that no longer exist in any form. Entire scientific traditions we cannot reconstruct because we do not even know what questions they were asking. Every generation since has built on incomplete foundations, solving problems that may have already been solved, reinventing knowledge that was once written down and protected, and then allowed to disappear because the people in charge decided it was not worth defending. Britain losing the colonies. King George III had the largest navy on earth, a professional army hardened by the 7 Years' War, and the industrial capacity of the world's dominant empire. His opponents were farmers, merchants, and part-time militia who could not reliably feed or pay their own troops. He lost. Not because the Americans were stronger, but because the British government could not stop making the same mistake, treating legitimate grievance as treason and responding to every act of resistance with a heavier hand that created more resistance. The trouble started with money. The 7 Years' War had doubled Britain's national debt. Parliament decided the American colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defence and began imposing taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, the Tea Act of 1773. None of these were ruinous. American colonists paid a fraction of the tax burden borne by British citizens at home. The amounts were almost trivial. The principle was not. The colonists had no representation in Parliament. They had no vote on the policies being imposed on them. And they had a century and a half of self-governing tradition that made external control feel like an invasion. Benjamin Franklin spent years in London as the colony's unofficial ambassador, offering compromise after compromise. Each time, Parliament chose punishment over negotiation. After the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, the response was the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Massachusetts lost its self-governance. Boston's harbour was closed. British soldiers were quartered in civilian homes. The intent was to isolate Massachusetts and terrify the other 12 colonies into obedience. The effect was the opposite. Moderates who had opposed independence now saw the Crown as a threat to every colony's autonomy. The Continental Congress formed. Militias organised. By the time shots were fired at Lexington in April 1775, Britain had unified its opposition through its own brutality. The war lasted 8 years. France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic all joined against Britain. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 cost Britain not just the 13 colonies, but the entire territory east of the Mississippi. The nation that emerged from that loss would become the wealthiest and most powerful country in human history, a superpower that Britain manufactured through sheer political arrogance. The empire was so accustomed to obedience that it interpreted every request for negotiation as defiance, and met every act of defiance with escalation until it had escalated its way out of a continent. Xerox giving away the GUI, Steve Jobs walked into the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in December 1979 and saw the future of computing sitting on a desk. A machine with a graphical desktop, overlapping windows, icons you could click, menus that drop down, and a small device called a mouse that let you point at things on screen. He later said it was the most important thing he had ever seen. Xerox had built the modern computer. Then Xerox did almost nothing with it. PARC was arguably the most productive research lab of the 20th century. Founded in 1970, it attracted elite computer scientists who invented not just the GUI, but also Ethernet networking, laser printing, object-oriented programming, and the what you see is what you get text editor. The Xerox Alto, built in 1973, was a fully functional personal computer with capabilities that would not appear in commercial products for another decade. Researchers at PARC knew what they had. They wrote memos. They gave demonstrations. They begged management to commercialize the technology. Xerox Corporate, 3,000 miles away in Connecticut, was a copier company run by copier executives who measured success in pages printed per minute. Personal computers did not fit their business model, so personal computers were treated as expensive curiosities. The visit that changed everything was arranged because Xerox had invested $1 million in Apple's pre-IPO stock. In exchange, Apple got a tour of PARC. Jobs brought his engineers. When they saw the Alto's interface, the room went quiet. Apple took the core concepts home, refined them heavily, added their own innovations, and built the Lisa and then the Macintosh. Microsoft saw the Macintosh and built Windows. Within a decade, graphical interfaces were standard on every personal computer sold. The entire paradigm, billions of devices, the way every human being now interacts with a computer, descended from what Xerox invented and then gave away for $1 million in stock. Xerox did try to ship its own version. The Xerox Star launched in 1981 at over $16,000 per unit, marketed exclusively to corporate offices. It sold about 25,000 units total. Xerox's Apple investment returned roughly $17 million when the company went public. A fine return, but pocket change next to the value of the ideas that walked out the door. The people at Park built the future. The people running Xerox could not see past the copier. It remains the single greatest failure of corporate imagination in the history of technology. AOL-Time Warner merger, $200 billion. That is roughly how much shareholder value the AOL-Time Warner merger destroyed. Not lost temporarily during a downturn. Destroyed. Evaporated. Written off. The deal was announced on January 10, 2000, at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble, and it combined an internet company built on dial-up modems with the largest traditional media conglomerate on Earth. It was the biggest corporate merger in history. It was also the worst. The pitch was seductive. AOL had 30 million subscribers, a dominant internet brand, and a market cap that had ballooned past $200 billion on pure 90s euphoria. Time Warner owned CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers, Time Magazine, and the second largest cable network in America. Merge them, and you get the future. Internet distribution married to world-class content. Steve Case, AOL's chief executive officer, and Gerald Levin, Time Warner's chief executive officer, told Wall Street this was the deal that would define the digital age. Wall Street applauded. The boards approved. Nobody asked the obvious question. What happens when the bubble pops and AOL's stock price, which is the currency paying for this merger, turns out to be a fiction? The bubble popped 3 months after the deal was announced, before the merger even closed. By the time it formally completed in January 2001, AOL's business was already cratering. Broadband was replacing dial-up. AOL's subscribers were leaving. The two corporate cultures collided like tectonic plates. Time Warner veterans, people who had built HBO and CNN from scratch, despised being told what to do by AOL executives they viewed as overpaid internet tourists. Technology integration failed. Advertisers fled. Internal warfare consumed more executive energy than any external competition. In 2002, the combined company posted a loss of $98.7 billion, the largest annual corporate loss in American history. Nearly $100 billion in goodwill was written off. Levin resigned. Case was forced out as chairman. Ted Turner, Time Warner's largest individual shareholder, lost over $8 billion personally and compared the experience to being in the army in World War II. In 2009, Time Warner formally spun off AOL, ending the merger entirely. The whole catastrophe had been built on a simple delusion, that a company's stock price equaled its actual value. AOL used imaginary money to buy a real company, and when the imaginary money disappeared, all that was left was the wreckage. Quibi streaming launch, $1.75 billion. Funding from every major Hollywood studio, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and a roster of investors who collectively decided that what the world desperately needed was a streaming service that only worked on phones and only showed videos under 10 minutes long. Quibi launched on April 6, 2020, and shut down on December 1, 2020. 239 days. That might be the fastest burn rate of venture capital in entertainment history. Jeffrey Katzenberg was the architect, former chairman of Walt Disney Studios, co-founder of DreamWorks, a man who had greenlit The Lion King and Shrek. He believed there was an untapped market for what he called quick bites, premium short-form content designed for the gaps in your day. Commutes, lunch breaks, waiting rooms. He recruited Meg Whitman, former chief executive officer of eBay and Hewlett-Packard, as his operational partner. They signed Steven Spielberg, Guillermo del Toro, Idris Elba, Chrissy Teigen, and dozens more. The talent list was absurd. The content budgets were feature film scale, compressed into 7-minute episodes. The pandemic was bad luck. COVID shut down the world 2 weeks before launch, erasing every commute and waiting room Katzenberg had been counting on. But blaming COVID is too generous. The structural problems were fatal regardless of timing. Quibi could not cast to a television. In 2020, when every competing service made casting effortless, Quibi insisted you watch on your phone. The app blocked screenshots, which meant nothing on the platform could go viral, which meant the shows had zero cultural presence. No one talked about Quibi because no one could share Quibi. And the core proposition was bankrupt from day one. YouTube was free. TikTok was free and addictive. Quibi was asking people to pay $8 a month for short videos that were more polished than TikTok but less interesting. By summer, the app had fewer than 72,000 daily active users. Katzenberg reportedly called every contact in Hollywood looking for a buyer. In October, the company announced it was shutting down. Roku bought the content library for what was rumored to be less than $100 million. Katzenberg took public responsibility. Quibi is a case study in what happens when industry veterans mistake their own enthusiasm for market demand. Nobody asked consumers whether they wanted this, or rather, consumers answered clearly with YouTube and TikTok, and Katzenberg decided they were wrong. Google plus social network. Google had the best engineers on the planet, unlimited money, and the most visited website in the world. They looked at Facebook and said, we can do that better. So they spent over $500 million building Google+, then forced it down the throats of every YouTube commenter, Gmail user, and Android owner on Earth. 7 years later, they quietly killed it, having proven that you cannot engineer your way into a party no one wants to attend. The launch in June 2011 actually went well. Tech reviewers loved Circles, a feature that let you sort contacts into groups and share selectively. 10 million sign-ups in 2 weeks. 90 million within months. The numbers looked great in a slide deck. The reality was a ghost town. People created accounts, looked around, saw none of their friends, and never came back. A social network is not a product. It is a behavior. And the behavior was already happening on Facebook, where your college roommate, your cousin, and your co-worker's dog all had profiles. No feature set, no matter how elegant, could overcome the fact that the people you wanted to talk to were somewhere else. Google's response to this problem was coercion. They made a Google Plus account mandatory for commenting on YouTube, a platform with 2 billion users who had never asked for this. They stuffed Plus integration into search results, Gmail, and Android setup. The strategy backfired catastrophically. YouTube's comment sections, already the internet's darkest corner, devolved into open revolt. Users did not feel invited to a new platform. They felt bullied into one. The resentment was loud and sustained. Internally, Google teams were pressured to bolt Plus features onto their own products, diverting engineering talent from actual priorities. The project became a company-wide tax that produced no company-wide benefit. In 2018, the Wall Street Journal reported that a security bug had exposed the personal data of up to 500,000 Google Plus users, and that Google had known for months and chosen not to disclose it. The company announced the consumer version would shut down. It closed in April 2019. Google Plus is proof that market dominance in one category buys you exactly nothing in another. Google owned search, email, maps, video, and mobile. None of that mattered. Social networking is not a technology problem. It is a human one. And humans had already decided where they wanted to be. FIFA Qatar World Cup bid. The technical evaluation ranked Qatar dead last among the bidding nations. Summer temperatures in Doha exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The country had no stadiums meeting FIFA standards, no football tradition, and a population smaller than the city of Houston. It won anyway. In December 2010, FIFA awarded the 2022 World Cup to Qatar, and the sport's governing body ignited the biggest corruption scandal in the history of international athletics. The vote was suspicious from the moment the envelope was opened. Subsequent investigations by the FBI, Swiss prosecutors, and investigative journalists uncovered systematic bribery at every level of the bid process. Multiple FIFA Executive Committee members were later indicted, banned, or convicted. Mohammed bin Hammam, a Qatari member of the committee, was banned from football for life. FIFA's own president, Sepp Blatter, was eventually suspended. The corruption was not subtle. It was structural. Qatar has consistently denied any wrongdoing, and the 2022 tournament was never stripped or reassigned. Hosting required construction on a scale that defied reason. 8 stadiums built from nothing. A brand new metro system. A brand new city called Lusail. Roads, hotels and infrastructure worth over $220 billion, making it the most expensive World Cup ever held by a factor of 10. The workforce that built all of it consisted almost entirely of migrant labourers from South Asia and Africa, employed under the kafala system, which tied workers to their employers, confiscated their passports, and restricted their ability to leave or change jobs. Investigations by The Guardian estimated that over 6,500 migrant workers from 5 South Asian nations died in Qatar between the bid being awarded and the tournament kicking off. Workers described conditions of extreme heat, overcrowded housing, and withheld wages. Qatar disputed the methodology and claimed that the death rate was proportional to the size of the labour force. The tournament was moved to November and December, the first Winter World Cup in history, ripping apart the schedules of every European league. On the field, the football delivered. The final between Argentina and France is widely considered the greatest World Cup match ever played. Off the field, the event was shadowed by protests over human rights, the criminalization of homosexuality, last-minute alcohol bans, and a fundamental question that FIFA never answered. At what point does the price of hosting a sporting event, measured in human lives, become too high to justify? Fyre Festival. The promotional video was perfect. Supermodels on a white sand beach, crystal water, yachts anchored offshore. Kendall Jenner, Bella Hadid, and Emily Ratajkowski posted matching orange tiles on Instagram, and the internet lost its mind. Tickets sold for up to $12,000. What arrived on the other end of that transaction, on a gravel lot in the Bahamas on April 28, 2017, was disaster relief tents, feral dogs, soaked mattresses, and a cheese sandwich in a styrofoam container that became the most iconic photograph of a scam in the social media age. Billy McFarland was 25, a serial exaggerator with a previous startup called Maginot that had already drawn fraud complaints. He partnered with rapper J. Rule to launch the Fyre app, a talent booking platform. The festival was supposed to be the marketing stunt that made the app famous. The original site was Norman's Cay in the Exuma chain, a private island with a history connected to the Pablo Escobar drug trade. When the island's owner pulled out, McFarland moved the event to a gravel lot adjacent to a sandals resort on Great Exuma. He did not tell the ticket holders. Nothing was ready. No stage capable of hosting major acts existed on site. The luxury villas shown in marketing materials did not exist. Performers cancelled when they realized the logistics were a fantasy. The gourmet catering amounted to bread, cheese, and salad. When charter flights landed and attendees stepped off expecting paradise, they found luggage dumped from shipping containers into a dark field. Fights broke out over tents. There was no running water. Medical resources were negligible. The Bahamian government had to step in and organize an emergency evacuation. Hundreds of people were stranded overnight on an island with no functional infrastructure. McFarland was arrested, charged with wire fraud, and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for defrauding investors of over $26 million. Ja Rule faced civil suits but avoided criminal charges. Local Bahamian workers who built the site went unpaid for months until a GoFundMe campaign raised partial compensation. 2 competing documentaries dropped in 2019, each more damning than the other. Fyre Festival became shorthand for the gap between what influencer marketing promises and what reality delivers. McFarland sold a fantasy optimized for Instagram. The only problem was that the people who bought it eventually had to show up in person. Mt. Gox Bitcoin Hack. The name stood for Magic, the Gathering Online Exchange. That is not a joke. The platform that would go on to handle over 70% of all Bitcoin transactions on Earth was originally built to trade fantasy game cards. When it collapsed in February 2014, approximately 850,000 Bitcoin vanished, worth $450 million at the time. At Bitcoin's later all-time high, those coins would have been valued at over $50 billion. The largest cryptocurrency theft in history happened at a company that started as a hobby and never really stopped being one. Jed McCaleb built the site in 2010 and sold it the following year to Marc Carpeles, a French programmer living in Tokyo. Carpeles was, by most accounts, technically capable, but operationally unprepared for what Mt. Gox became. As Bitcoin surged from obscurity to front-page news, the exchange grew from handling a few hundred transactions a day to processing the vast majority of global Bitcoin volume. The infrastructure did not scale. The codebase was a patchwork of shortcuts. There was no proper version control, no serious security audit, no separation of duties. Carpeles was chief executive officer, lead developer, and systems administrator of what was effectively a multi-billion-dollar financial institution running on the organizational structure of a one-person blog. The theft was not a single dramatic break-in. It was a slow bleed. Attackers exploited a flaw called transaction malleability, which allowed them to manipulate transaction identifiers and trick the system into processing duplicate withdrawals. Bitcoin drained from Mt. Gox wallets over months, possibly years, while the exchange continued operating as if everything were normal. By the time Carpeles noticed the shortfall, the vault was empty. On February 7, 2014, Mt. Gox froze all withdrawals. On the 24th, the website went dark. On the 28th, the company filed for bankruptcy in Tokyo. 24,000 creditors were locked out. Carpeles was arrested in 2015, acquitted of embezzlement, but convicted of manipulating financial records. Roughly 200,000 of the missing Bitcoin were later found in a forgotten cold wallet, leading to a decade-long bankruptcy proceeding that is still distributing recovered funds to creditors. Mt. Gox was the moment the cryptocurrency world learned, painfully, that decentralized money does not help you if the place you store it is held together with tape and wishful thinking.